If a grizzly bear and a snowplow had a baby, it would be an Arvin. And if that baby grew up to do CrossFit in an avalanche while discussing philosophy, still an Arvin. Tonight, we're diving into the ice-cracked, muscle-packed enigma of the Arvins. Humanity's extinct cousins, who didn't just survive the Ice Age, they slapped it across the face and built a home in its ruins. These weren't your stereotypical club-wielding grunters. Oh no. Arvins were like nature's version of a bodybuilder-architect hybrid, complete with wild strength, odd charm, and a suspiciously good eye for spatial design. So before we get neck-deep in mammoth marrow and stone tools, hit that follow button and subscribe to the channel, but only if you like riding shotgun on strange historical journeys like this one. And hey, drop a comment letting me know where you're tuning in from, and whether it's currently day, night, or some bizarre liminal space in between. I love seeing the global cave we're all huddled in. Now go ahead, flick the lights off, summon that soothing hum from your desk fan, and settle in. Tonight, we time travel to a forgotten continent. Picture this. You step into frostbitten Eurasia, around 78,000 years ago. Within seconds, your eyelashes are freezing, your breath is a puff of regret, and your soul is quietly questioning your life choices. But just before hypothermia kicks in, your eyes lock onto a figure in the distance, a bulky, barrel-chested being, staring straight at you like you owe him firewood. You've met an Arvin, not just any Ice Age survivor, but the undisputed heavyweight of the hominin world, apex predator, survivalist artist, and built like he was born to headbutt glaciers. Let's talk design. If Arvins were a car, they'd be a tank with snow tires and a fireplace in the back seat. Short by modern standards averaging, just 5'3" to 5'6", they weren't small, so much as compressed power. Think of them as evolutionary kettlebells. Thick necks, wide torsos, and arms like tree trunks. Their bones? Less bone, more fortified scaffolding. Calling them stocky is like calling an anvil slightly heavy. These beings were dense. Their frames were layered in thick muscle, with torsos that looked purpose-built for smashing through blizzards or lifting half a forest's worth of firewood. Their rib cages flared wide like ancient furnaces, their shoulders arched like archways, and their limbs screamed function over form. They weren't built for beauty, they were built to win fistfights with frostbite. Their limbs were short, yes but mighty, a compactness born of bitter winds and brutal terrain. Cold eats heat, so minimizing surface area was key. Their hands? Gigantic. Hands that looked like they could twist a boulder in half or rip a stubborn tree root from frozen ground just to say they could. Also handy for cracking bone marrow, skinning prey, or opening ice-locked fruit jars of the ancient world, assuming those existed. Now, the face. Ah, the face. Arvins didn't look like Usway, looked like bad copies of them. Their skulls were elongated, their brows protruding like nature's built-in helmet visors. Their noses were huge and forward-pointing, like they'd been optimized for both breathing cold air and sensing trouble. Chins? Optional. Jawlines? All business. Their expressions probably rested somewhere between mildly suspicious and eternally prepared to throw hands. But don't confuse rugged with dumb. The Arvins weren't caveman cliches, they were a parallel version of us, equally advanced in different ways. They weren't a mistake. They were nature's alternate prototype for human too. And in their world, they thrived. Arvins were the Iron Men of the Pleistocene. Every inch of their frame screamed, "I fought a saber-tooth before breakfast. You think you're tough because you went to the gym twice this week?" These folks were dragging carcasses uphill while dodging avalanches. Their lives were hit workouts, 24/7. Their bones tell the story. They weren't just thick, they were impossibly thick. Architecture thick, Gothic cathedral thick. Their femurs were short and barrel-like, meant for hauling body mass through steep, icy landscapes. Running marathons? Not their style. Carrying 3 days of meat and a boulder, just in case. Now we're talking. Their knees were marvels of prehistoric engineering designed for constant bending, crouching, and sudden lunges. These were squat-savvy knees, the kind of joints that saw a mammoth coming and whispered, "Bring it," whether they were building a shelter, scraping a hide, or rummaging in a beast's guts. their knees held the line. And those arms. Oh, those terrifying arms. Upper arms thicker than some modern human's thighs. Forearms even bigger. This unique trait made them champions of brute labor. They weren't just hauling, chopping, dragging, smashing. They were doing it all without gloves, sleeves, or whining. The average Arvin could have curled a stone axe like it was a protein shake. If we humans are sleek multi-tools, the Arvins were sledgehammers. Efficient, reliable, and wildly overbuilt. Even their rib cages were uniquely adapted. Modern human torsos taper like elegant vases. Arvin torsos like industrial tanks. Their rib cages flared outward, leaving more room for massive lungs necessary to breathe in cold, thin Ice Age air, while sprinting through a forest with 70 pounds of meat on their back. Their respiratory system wasn't just functional, it was fierce. They were like bellows forged in a mountain forge. More oxygen in, more survival juice out. And that skull? Oh, it was a masterpiece of battle readiness. Not just the iconic brow ridges, which, let's be honest, could probably stop a spear, but also the thickness, the flattened cranium, the sheer surface area for muscle attachment. They had necks that made professional wrestlers look dainty. Their jaws could crunch frozen meat like it was a granola bar. Venison popsicles? Not a problem. But strength has a price. These human cousins matured faster, lived shorter lives, and every year was a festival of bruises, broken bones, and beautiful chaos. Their skeletons are roadmaps of violence and resilience, healed fractures, worn joints, trauma stacked on trauma, like war medals from the Pleistocene battlefield. They weren't just survivors, they were veterans of life's most punishing terrain. If you shook an Arvin's hand, you'd probably need to reassemble yours afterward. Now, let's address the cerebral beast in the cave. Their brains. Yes, the Arvins had massive brains. Not clever raccoon big. Not science teacher big. We're talking 450 cubic centimeters, on average larger than modern humans. That's right, the so-called primitive folk had more cranial cargo than you or I. But weight bigger doesn't always mean smarter. Whales have big brains and still swim naked. What made the Arvins special was how they used those brains. Their wiring was honed for survival. High-level sensory processing, laser-sharp vision, movement coordination that could dodge a stampede in the snow, mid-spear throw. Their brains were less about philosophy and more about efficiency. Less, why are we here? And more, where's the food? And how do I kill it without becoming it? So, while modern humans were still working up to inventing the hammock or sliced bread, the Arvins were out there building efficient lives from muscle, grit, and sheer nerve. Imagine waking up every day to the sound of wind howling like an angry beast outside your cave door, snow blowing sideways, and your only plan being, time to go track a moose through a frozen hellscape, barefoot. Welcome to an average Monday for the Arvins, our frostbitten, thick-browed Ice Age cousins who were out here thriving in conditions modern humans wouldn't last a podcast episode in. Survival for them wasn't about sipping mushroom lattes while checking the weather app. No, they had to feel the storm in their bones, squint through frost-smeared air, and know exactly when the elk herds were moving or risk starving. And they had to do all this without GPS, Google Earth, or Instagram reels about wilderness hacks. Just raw instinct, coordination, and maybe the occasional grunt of wisdom passed down from Grandma Arvin. Their eyes were their secret weapon. The Arvins weren't just surviving on muscle and jaw power, they had next-level vision. Scientists believed their visual cortex, the part of the brain that processes sight, was unusually large. We're talking eagle-level perception, frost-sharpened pupils, scanning snowy plains with pinpoint clarity. Picture an Arvin, half covered in bear hide, standing on a ridge with the wind in his beard, scanning the valley like a shaggy Ice Age anime hero, but less hair gel and fewer soliloquies. And yes, their brain was wired for more than brute instinct. Sure, their let's pause and think this through section, the prefrontal cortex, might have been smaller than ours in proportion. But that doesn't mean they were all brawn and zero brains. Far from it. You don't coordinate complex hunts, fashion hand-stitched winter coats, and paint symbolic art on stone walls by winging it. These folks made plans. They cooperated. They imagined things. They didn't just build tools, they improved them. They didn't just wear hides, they stitched them. Some even daubed red ochre on their skin because why not add a little prehistoric glam while butchering a bison? So yeah, your ancient Arvan aunt might have been the original contour queen. TikTok didn't invent makeup, your cave-dwelling ancestors did, with crushed rocks and flair. And they got around. These beings weren't confined to one little corner of the map. From the breezy grasslands of Central Asia to the snow-drenched forests of Ice Age Europe, Arvans made themselves at home. That took more than brute force. It required adaptability, mental dexterity, and a knack for innovation. Whether they were tanning leather in Spain or cracking bones in Siberia, Arvans adjusted to the local vibe, resource pool, and climate-like prehistoric MacGyvers. And let's be honest, early archaeologists did the Arvans dirty. For decades, scholars chalked up any tool, bead, or painting found in the same layer as Arvans to Homo sapiensaur species, because surely we were the creative ones. Then, surprise, they started finding jewelry, engravings, and pigment use that predated our arrival in those same regions. Turns out, Arvans weren't the students crashing humanity's party. They were the ones who built the house and hung the first cave paintings. So if nature had a build the ultimate survivalist contest, Arvans wouldn't just win, they'd take the trophy, use it as a hammer, and then invent a second use for it as a snowshoe. Arvans weren't just scraping by. They were evolution's frost-hardened champions. In a world without parkas, central heating, or grocery stores, they adapted like champions forged in ice. Think of weather so cold your soul shivers, just remembering it. Now imagine living in that. No thermal socks, no microfleece, just fur, fire, and a dream. Their build wasn't some weird accident. It was survival architecture. Compact, thick-set bodies retained heat, better vital when your front yard was a blizzard and your ceiling dripped icicles. Their limbs? Short and dense, like nature's answer to losing fingers to frostbite. Penguins probably saw them and said, respect. And those massive nosiches, they were there for a reason, not for sniffing drama, but to warm and humidify Arctic air before it reached the lungs. Built-in HVAC systems, courtesy of natural selection. Say what you will about the aesthetic, but in terms of functionality, 10 out of 10. That face could warm air, frighten predators, and support a pretty impressive unibrow. Even their skin likely played a role in the survival game. While we can't know their exact pigmentation, many scientists suggest they had lighter skin useful for absorbing every precious drop of vitamin D during endless gray winters. Imagine living through 6 straight months of gloom and still having the biological audacity to make your own sunshine. Let's talk lungs. Arvans needed heavy-duty breathing equipment, hauling game, carving spears, climbing icy slopes, and sprinting from angry megafauna isn't something you do with light cardio. Their wide, flared chests weren't just for looking swole around the campfire. They were organic furnaces burning calories, keeping warm and powering through the daily chaos of staying alive. And while pop culture often paints Arvans wearing fur thongs and caveman couture, reality is far more fashionable, relatively speaking. They weren't running around like extras in a budget fantasy movie. These folks wore tailored hide garments, stitched with bone needles. They weren't just wrapping themselves in dead animal capes. They softened hides, poked holes, and laced together custom winterwear like Ice Age fashionistas, haute couture with a hint of mammoth. Sewing requires foresight, precision, coordination, and probably a lot of grumbling. But they did it. Winter coats, leggings, boots, functional fashion that told the Ice Age, do your worst. And while we're on fashion, let's discuss accessories. Oh yes, Arvans accessorized. At archaeological sites, researchers have found eagle talons, pierced shells, and beads items that had no practical purpose except to say, look at me, I'm fabulous and deadly. Picture it, a burly Arvan striding into camp, claw necklace swinging, dripping with primal swagger. Yes, I caught the bird myself. No, you can't touch it. Now that's a look. And red ochre? Not just for tools. They painted with it, wore it, maybe even ritualized it. Was it body art? Clan identity? Pure flair? We'll never know for sure. But someone, somewhere, stared at a crushed red rock and said, "This would look excellent, smeared across my cheeks before a hunt." And honestly, they were probably right. No, they weren't ready for Paris Fashion Week. But if there had been a runway made of snow, torchlight, and mammoth bones, the Arvins would have stomped it with confidence. Their clothing wasn't just practical, it was identity, protection, power, and maybe, just maybe, the earliest known form of look good, feel good, hunt better. So next time someone tells you Arvins were dumb brutes, remember, these were cold weather champions with advanced spatial awareness, emotional cooperation, and a better wardrobe than you'd expect for a people who lived in caves. They sewed, they accessorized, they planned, painted, and survived, and did it all without a single YouTube tutorial. If you're enjoying this Ice Age saga, don't forget to follow and subscribe to the channel for the next wild chapter. Let's keep digging into the past tusks, bone needles, fur coats, and all. Let's take a moment to appreciate one thing about Arvin fashion. Every piece was eco-friendly, handmade, and guaranteed to have involved mild to moderate violence. Think about Itno factories. No fast fashion, no fake tags, just pure Ice Age couture, sourced, stitched, and stained in mammoth blood. It was the kind of primal luxury that no influencer can fake. And speaking of things you can't fake strength, real, terrifying, myth-breaking strength, the Arvins weren't just strong. They were punch-a-hairy, tank-in-the-face strong. The kind of strong that makes you question whether physics took a little break back then. Their muscles looked less like flesh and more like coiled rope forged in frost. Everything about their anatomy screamed, lift with your back and your soul. Huge shoulders, absurdly powerful legs, and arms that could probably bench press your house. These weren't just show muscles. This wasn't mirror-gazing gym strength. This was the kind of raw power needed for daily activities like spear hurling, elk wrestling, boulder hauling, and occasionally flipping a cave bear because it was blocking the fire pit. Their bone density? Ludicrous. If modern bones are scaffolding, Arvin bones were siege towers, sturdy enough to support colossal muscle mass and handle catastrophic impact. These people didn't break easily, and when they did, they often just walked it off like an irritated mountain. But how strong were they really? Estimates suggest that the average male Arvin could outmuscle a modern human by up to 50%, and that's the conservative take. When it comes to upper body strength, they may have been twice as powerful. That's not, I help you move a couch strength. That's, I accidentally ripped the couch in half and apologize with a mammoth steak strength. These weren't hunters who sat behind bushes tossing dainty projectiles. Arvins liked things up close and personal. You know that feeling when your microwave beeps and you rush to get your food? That was their hunting energy eggs. Except instead of soup, it was a 2-ton murder pig with tusks. And instead of a microwave, it was a sharpened stick. They charged large, furious animals head-on, jabbed spears into thick hides at kissable distances. Their version of catching dinner involved dodging tusks, surviving blunt trauma, and holding eye contact with rage incarnate. And their bones? Oh, their bones tell the whole horror story. Archaeological records are littered with healed fractures, cracked ribs, skull injuries, and general orthopedic chaos. Basically, the average Arvin skeleton looks less like a timeline of aging and more like the end credits of a prehistoric demolition derby. You know that guy who brags about never going to the doctor? That was everyone in an Arvin tribe. Got a broken arm? Rub some moss on it, grunt a few times, and get back to chasing elk. Their grip strength alone was legendary. Researchers believe an Arvin could crush a modern human hand like a stale biscuit. Their thumbs were massive, fingers like stone sausages, knuckles the size of walnuts, and not the friendly snack kind, the weaponized kind. If you're imagining a fuzzy version of a strongman competition finalist, throwing axes and squinting dramatically into the wind, you're in the right neighborhood. Let's not kid ourselves. If you met an Arvin in a dark forest, you'd apologize for breathing too loud. And these folks didn't just live hard. They lived brutally. Not "I missed my bus" hard. More like "I tackled a woolly death monster before breakfast" hard. Their daily routines involved more bone trauma than a professional stunt double's worst week. In fact, scientists began noticing a disturbing pattern. The kinds of injuries found on Arvin remains, they weren't random. They mirrored trauma seen in rodeo riders. You read that right. Rodeo riders. People who climb onto furious bulls for fun. The same crushed ribs, broken arms, fractured faces. Which makes sense. Really, if your food can trample you into paste, dinner is also a fight club. Let me introduce you to an old friend from the past. Shinar the First, an Arvin whose skeleton reads like the ultimate survival resume. Shinar had a partially crushed skull, likely leaving him half blind. His right arm, useless from an old break. His foot, also injured. Imagine the prehistoric equivalent of someone walking around with a limp, a blackout in one eye, and an elbow that clicks when it rain sands, still making it to every hunt. The amazing part? Shinar didn't die from those injuries. He lived for years after them, which means one thing: someone looked out for him. Other Arvins likely shared food, helped him walk, maybe even tied his snowshoes. That's not just survival. That's humanity. That's Ice Age empathy wrapped in sinew and fur. And it wasn't just him. Old Bayshak, another famous skeleton, was elderly, toothless, riddled with arthritis, and spinal issues galore. Yet he too survived well past what most of us would consider a good day. His bones weren't just ancient. They were evidence of caregiving, compassion, support, community. Apparently, even when you were a hunched mess of crackly joints and missing molars, you still got a warm spot by the fire. So let's recap. Arvins didn't just take damage, they tanked it, over and over. Then they got up and did it again. With crushed faces, shattered ribs, busted knees, they still trudged through blizzards to hunt beasts the size of studio apartments. They were the living embodiment of pain is temporary, mammoth stew is forever. And remember, these were not people who stayed safe, picked berries, and avoided risk. Their lifestyle was danger with a side of chaos. They didn't hunt from a distance. Their weapons were heavy, awkward, and up close. Think stab, not throw. And when you stab something that's trying to kill you, things get messy. So the next time you complain about a stubbed toe, remember, the average Arvin took a horn to the chest, patched it with dirt, and still had energy left to flirt with the redhead by the fire. And let's not forget their relationship with fire. Arvins didn't just survive the cold, they punched winter in the throat. Fire wasn't some accidental discovery for Thamit, was a game changer, and they knew it. Fire was their weapon, their warmth, their beacon, and their blender all in one. They weren't flinging fireballs or grilling marshmallows, but they were keeping the flames alive through blizzards, cooking tough meat, fending off predators, and turning caves into toasty bunkers of survival. How do we know all this? Stay tuned. Let's talk about Arvins and fire, their favorite frenemy. Not a casual flick of the bic, not your dad's lighter from 1987, no. We're talking raw, stone-banging, blister-inducing, chaos-sparking firecraft. The kind where you squat in the cold clack rocks like a maniac and pray that dry moss explodes into flame before frostbite sets in. At ancient Arvin campsites, we find the ashes of their ambition. Centralized hearths, surrounded by burned bone fragments, cracked stones, and char lines drawn by the kind of patient pyromania that only Ice Age survival can inspire. These weren't forest fires, they were intentional fire pits, used again and again, year after year. Someone wasn't just surviving out there, they were meal prepping in the snow like a Michelin-starred barbarian. It wasn't luck either. The going theory is that Arvins mastered flint-on-pyrite techniques, generating sparks without matches, lighters, or even a smug tutorial video. Just two rocks, some flammable fluff, and blind faith. It was the glacial era version of hold my meat. Fire wasn't just warmth, it was everything. They used it to cook food, making it softer, tastier, and easier to digest. That alone gave them a serious evolutionary edge. Fewer parasites, more calories, fewer broken teeth on frozen mammoth steak. Plus, cooked meals meant less chewing time, freeing up hours for other advanced activities like tool making, or maybe gossiping about who scorched the last reindeer ribs. And let's talk tools. Heating flint before shaping it? Genius. Thermal stress weakens the stone slightly, making it easier to flake and mold. In other words, Arvins may have been dabbling in heat-based material science back when humans still hadn't invented bureaucratic meetings. That's prehistoric innovationo committee, just instinct and flames. Fire also served as a glowing no-thanks sign to predators. The flickering light warded off saber-toothed mood swings and giant cave bears with boundary issues. When night fell, the Arvins didn't cower in silence. They circled the fire, roasted meat, told stories, and watched their shadows dance across cave walls like living mythology. Fire was heat, safety, and stage lighting rolled into one. Were they the first to discover fire? Likely not, but they made it theirs. In typical Arvin fashion, they didn't brag. They just used fire to make caves feel like home and turned steak into something slightly less chewy along the way. Now imagine one of them, sitting at the edge of that fire, holding a chunk of stone, no fancy gear, no instruction manual, just a brain, a dream, and the kind of focus only a blizzard can forge. What they create next? Tools, beautifully violent tools. Their toolkit wasn't just a pile of sharp rocks. It was a carefully designed collection of scraping, stabbing, and slicing solutions, each made with planning, precision, and the kind of controlled aggression you'd expect from someone who fights dinner for a living. The Arvins used what we now call the Valoran method, a stoneworking process so complex that, even today, archaeologists occasionally mistake Arvin tools for those made by Homo sapiens. This method involved shaping a stone core in such a way that the resulting flakes popped off in predictable, useful shapes. It wasn't chaos, it was craftsmanship. Among their arsenal were scrapers, awls, borers, piercing tools, and weight for ith-hafted weapons. Hafted, as in blades attached to wooden handles with sinew and pine resin. That's not rock smashing. That's early composite technology. Duct tape meets survivalist engineering, 0 years before anyone ever invented frustration. And they used these tools for everything: skinning carcasses, shaping hides, carving wood, and probably passive-aggressively poking rivals in the ribs. If you gave an Arvin 10 minutes and a flint core, they'd give you a butchering set sharp enough to terrify modern kitchens. More importantly, Arvin tools varied from place to place. That means they weren't just copying each other. They were thinking, adapting, and innovating. One tribe might use flint, another limestone. Some even tinkered with bone and antler prepping for what we now recognize as Ice Age Etsy, local tools, regional pride, handmade survival. And as time marched forward, their tools got better, more elegant, more efficient, and yes, more lethal. This wasn't natural selection alone. It was brains, practice, refinement. They learned by doing, improved by failing, and passed those skills on with patience and dirty hands. But let's shift gears. Let's get emotional, because there's a softer, more surprising side to the Arvinzone that rarely makes it into Hollywood portrayals. Beneath the grit, the blood, and the cracked teeth was something tender, something human. Arvins had culture. Yeah, I said it. Culture. And not just the kind that grows on forgotten leftovers. Start with the dead. Arvins buried theirs. They didn't just toss grandma behind a bush and high-five fate. Archaeological sites show shallow graves, some containing objects placed deliberately beside the deceased. Tools, bones, perhaps even flowers, yes. Flowers. At several burial sites, traces of ancient pollen suggest that blossoms were placed with the bodies. Now, were they floral arrangements? Spiritual rituals? Or did someone just say, "Hey, grunk like these"? We may never know. But it proves one thing. They cared. They remembered. They mourned. And art? Oh yes, the Arvans had a creative streak. For decades, scholars smugly assumed only Homo sapiens made cave art. Then Spain threw a prehistoric curveballed ochre cave paintings dated to over 64,000 years ago, long before our species arrived in Europe. Suddenly, the narrative cracked open like an overripe mammoth egg. Arvans were decorating caves, piercing shells, collecting eagle talons. These items weren't useful in the day-to-day grind of survival. They were aesthetic, symbolic, maybe even fashionable. If you've ever worn something that had no logical purpose but made you feel cooler, congrats, you have something in common with Arvans. Whether it was a bead, a feather, or a claw necklace that screamed, "Yes, I did hunt that eagle," the message was clear. Expression mattered. And then there's the most mysterious of all Arvan creations, the Bruni complex. Deep inside a pitch-black cave in southern France, far from sunlight, far from logic, researchers discovered circles made from broken stalagmites, neatly arranged rings of stone dating back 176,000 years. No paintings, no torches, no obvious purpose, just deliberate construction in the dark. Were they summoning something? Holding rituals? Practicing pre-industrial interior design? We have no clue, but the message is undeniable. These people were capable of abstraction, of creation without immediate utility. And language? Yeah, they probably had that too. Arvans possessed the hyoid bone, a structure crucial for speech, as well as FOXP2 genes connected to language processing in modern humans. So while they may not have written poetry or complained about slow Wi-Fi, it's likely they communicated using a range of complex sounds. Somewhere, an Arvan once turned to another and said something heartfelt, probably about food, but still heartfelt. So here we are, looking back through smoke and snow at a people who could crush bones, stitch hide armor, bury their dead with grace, and maybe even whisper bedtime stories around a fire. Not just brutes, not just survivors, but architects of meaning in a world that offered none. All right, let's stop pretending and get to what you're really wondering. Yesur Ice Age cousins, the Arvans, and early humans didn't just wave across the tundra and keep it platonic. When Homo modernists rolled into Europe and Asia some 60,000 years ago, they encountered the locals, the stocky, brow-heavy, winter-proof Arvan sand. Well, things got cozy. Not metaphorically, genetically, biblically, undeniably. Instead of an awkward family reunion dynamic, what unfolded was more of a slippery furs and candlelit cave situation. It turns out ancient humans weren't just looking for shelter, they were also out here forming prehistoric power couples. And how do we know this? Because our DNA still carries their ancient fingerprints like genetic lipstick on the collar of time. Most people today with ancestry outside Africa carry a little Arvan with them, about 1 to 4% of their genome, in fact. Which means someone in your extensive family tree had an Ice Age encounter that was a bit more intimate mammoth hunting partner than distant acquaintance. Was it love? Survival instinct? An awkward result of limited options on Tinder Rock? We'll never know the exact mood, but the gene flow is there. And it didn't happen just once. Genetic analysis shows it was a repeated pattern multiple times, in multiple regions, over thousands of years. So no, this wasn't just one lost Homo sapien at a weird cave rave. This was a long-term evolutionary habit. Interestingly, the mixing seems to have tilted more often toward Arvan males and early modern human females. Maybe it was the strong arms. Maybe it was the storytelling. Or maybe the ability to start fires was the ancient version of, "I have a good job in my own hut." We may never know if the attraction was romantic, strategic, or just opportunistic in a blizzard. But what we do know is it left a legacy. That legacy shows up today in surprising ways. Your love of grilled meat, your immune system's sassiness, or even your unexplainable dislike of cilantro might trace back to an Arvan date night. Your genes are basically whispering, once upon a time, great-great-grandma made a very bold decision. Some traits we carry today, like how our skin reacts to sunlight, how our hair curls, how we handle pain, may be linked to Arvan genetics. Your tendency to sneeze when walking into the cold? Possibly an ancient survival quirk from someone who once dragged a bear carcass through a snowstorm for dinner. But it wasn't just one encounter with genetics, and then we moved on. These rendezvous happened again, and again genetic fingerprints show recurring mingling across centuries. It was enough to leave lasting impressions in immunity, metabolism, and even mood regulation. That's right, if you're extra broody during winter, or get melancholic at dusk, it might not be seasonal depression. It might be ancestral memory from your glacially inclined ancestors who sat around fires thinking about life, death, and whether cave lighting was flattering. But not all of these inherited traits are wins. Some Arvan gene variants have been linked to health complications like type 2 diabetes, depression, and nicotine addiction. So that dramatic craving for salty snacks at 2 a.m. could be part Ice Age reflex, part modern regret. Meanwhile, populations with deep roots in Africa generally don't carry Arvan DNA. That's because their ancestors didn't migrate out of Africa to mingle with Arvans. But they've got their own twist in the genetic taloremnants from other archaic human cousins, like the elusive Denovics, who contributed their own tangled chapters to the human story. The family tree isn't a neat line, it's more like an overgrown shrub tangled with weird love triangles. And while Arvans didn't survive as a distinct species, they didn't vanish without a trace. They melted into us. Their DNA lives in our cells. In a weird, poetic way, they didn't die out, they became part of us. Still, around 40 years ago, Arvans did vanish from the Earth. No explosion, no sudden catastrophe, just a gradual silence. Like they didn't get the invite to the post-Ice Age party. So what happened? Theories abound. One is climate change. As the last ice age ended and the environment warmed, everything shifted. Familiar hunting grounds changed. Big prey moved north or disappeared entirely. Even the weather started pulling stunts Arvans weren't prepared for. Bodies optimized for cold suddenly became liabilities. Instead of blizzards, they got spring. Instead of predictable mammoths, they got spooked rabbits. Another major factor? Us, Homo sapiens. When modern humans arrived in Arvan territory, we brought more than curiosity and an appetite for elk. We brought better ranged weapons, broader diets, and a dangerously persistent tendency to survive. Our bodies may have been less durable, but our minds were annoyingly adaptive. We traveled farther, reproduced faster, communicated more, whispered plans across fires, and taught each other how to outwit danger. The Arvans didn't lack intelligence, but in the long run, they may have been outnumbered, out-networked, and outlasted. There's also the genetic puzzle. Arvan populations were small and isolated. Less genetic diversity means higher vulnerability to disease, adaptation failure, and reproductive complications. That's biology's way of saying, tight-knit tribes are great until winter hits and everyone's immune system panics. So, over time, they faded. Not with a bang, not with screams, but with a slow, dimming torchlight in the back of a cold, forgotten cave. But let's not mourn. Let's remember who they were. They survived in a world that would kill most of us in minutes. They shaped stone, stitched hide, mastered fire, and painted meaning onto rock. They raised their injured, honored their dead, and loved maybe not like us, but with the same fierce will to protect and pass on something of themselves. And they did. So if you've ever sat by a fire and stared into the glow, if you've felt the cold and pulled your coat tighter by instinct, if you've looked up at a harsh winter sky and felt something ancient tugging in your chest that might be the Arvan in you, still burning, still here. Imagine a prehistoric survival game show, except instead of alliances and puzzles, the prize is not freezing to death, and your neighbors are reproducing like it's an Olympic event. That's the final stretch in the story of the Arvans, our extinct cousins who didn't get conquered or wiped out in a single bloody sweep. Nope, this wasn't a dramatic takeover with battle cries and cave ambushes. It was something far subtler and far more human. There's no overwhelming evidence of war or mass slaughter between the Arvans and early modern humans. No burned villages, no skulls with spearheads sticking out at ominous angles. Instead, the record whispers a different story. For thousands of years, Arvans and Homo sapiens shared land, traded genetics, exchanged ideas, and probably had the kind of awkward conversations around campfires that start with, "So, do you also eat mammoth?" Over time, they blended. The pure Arvan populations began to fade not because they were exterminated, but because they were absorbed, gradually, gently, like cream stirred into coffee. Until one day, there were no more distinct Arvans, left only echoes of them in our blood and bone. The last known Arvans likely survived in places like southern Iberia, modern-day Gibraltar, remote, rugged places where cold winds still carry memories. They held on for a while. Not centuries, but millennia. Their flame didn't flicker out overnight, it dimmed slowly, like the final coals of a long-burning fire. And then, the silence. The archaeological record stops humming. No new tools, no burials, just quiet. But this wasn't failure. It was the end of a chapter that left fingerprints everywhere. The Arvans may have disappeared, but they didn't vanish. They became part of us. Not in marble statues or mythic scrolls, but in DNA, in the slope of a nose, in a quirk of the immune system, in the resilience that kept our species going long after the glaciers melted. And yet, for most of modern history, the Arvans got the raw end of the reputational stick. Not in evolutionary terms, but in PR. They were the victims of history's worst smear campaign. When the first Arvan fossils were unearthed in the 1800s, scientists didn't know what to make of them. Big brows, weird limbs, heavy bones. It was like finding a bodybuilder who'd lost a fight with a museum exhibit. Victorian scholars, ever prone to judgment and uncomfortable chairs, decided Arvans must have been dull-witted cavemen, the kind of folks who couldn't be trusted near fire or polite conversation. Thus began the legend of the stooped, brute half-monster, half-embarrassing relative. The name Arvan, or in their case Neanderthal, didn't help either. It sounded more like something that would hiss under a bridge than a people who painted with ochre and buried their dead with ceremony. Early reconstructions sealed their fate. One infamous depiction showed an Arvan hunched over like a sad gorilla, eyes vacant, posture broken. The problem? That skeleton belonged to an elderly individual with arthritis. That's like assuming all humans walk with canes and scream at clouds because you met one cranky grandpa during allergy season. But the image stuck. Cartoons, museum dioramas, even school textbooks ran with it. The Arvan became the symbol of prehistoric failure, hairy, slow, silent, and confused. While in reality, these beings were inventors, artists, caretakers, and possibly the original Ice Age fashionistas. Why did we flatten their story? Because it made us feel special. Painting ourselves as the genius species, smart, sleek, chosen, was easier when we cast the Arvans as failed prototypes. Cavemen on the wrong side of evolution. It propped up our narrative and smoothed over the awkward truth that we share more with them than we'd care to admit. It also let us ignore the fact that we, well, mixed with them. Because you can't claim to be completely superior when your great-great-great-great-grandparent had a passionate winter romance with one of the others. So we turned them into punchlines and cautionary tales, tucked away behind museum glass and bad Halloween costumes. But that myth is crumbling. With every new archaeological dig, with every genome sequenced, the story gets clearer. Arvans weren't mistakes. They were a parallel masterpiece, different approach, same destination. Their story didn't end in shame. It ended in us. And while that part of their journey closed quietly, without epic battles or climactic falls, it didn't vanish. The last fires of the Arvans flickered out not because they were weak, but because the world changed. And we, their cousins, kept walking. In the ashes of Japan's twilight era, where loyalty was law and the battlefield made kings, a storm was quietly taking shape. She was born not into glory, but grit likely into a lesser-known samurai family on the outskirts of what would become a nation torn in two. Her name would be whispered by campfires and carved into legend, Tomoe Gozen. Some records suggest she was raised in the household of the ambitious warlord Minamoto no Yoshinaka himself. Others say she may have been his ward, his retainer, or perhaps even something more intimate. What remains clear is this, however: Tomoe entered his world. She earned her place in it, not with pedigree, but with pain, practice, and a blade sharper than tradition. While boys were handed swords and declared warriors by default, Tomoe had to prove repeatedly that she belonged in that world, that she could swing a blade with as much precision as any man, that her loyalty didn't need to be spoken, it was carved into every scar she earned. Her training would have been merciless. Mastering the katana wasn't just about raw power. It demanded discipline, balance, and the ability to read an opponent like a scroll of intent. She trained in kenjutsu for swordplay, kyudo for archery, and learned to ride war horses at full gallop, composing chaos into a deadly waltz. In rare pauses between battles, she likely took up the naginata curved polearm, often taught to women in the warrior class. But make no mistake, this wasn't some ceremonial blade for parades. This was forged for cleaving limbs and splitting the ranks of charging enemies. Tomoe's fighting style was an art of elegance soaked in blood. She didn't just match the men around her, she surpassed them. With every arrow she loosed, every opponent she unseated, she chipped away at the mountain of tradition that said she didn't belong. Before her name was etched into the annals of war, it had to be forged in shadow. Most women didn't speak in strategy halls. Most women didn't wield steel on battlefields. And most women weren't expected to outlive the first clash of blades. But Tomoe didn't follow the rules. She redefined them. Every skill she mastered had to be twice as sharp, twice as fast, and twice as deadly. Because if she failed, it wouldn't be seen as a soldier's flaw, it would be seen as proof that a woman should never have been trusted with steel. So before she ever carved her name into history, she carved a path through an unforgiving world. Not through luck, not by favor, but by sheer force of will. By the time she reached adulthood, Japan was tearing at the seams. The Genpei War had erupted, a brutal civil war between the rival Taira and Minamoto clans. It wasn't just a battle for territory. It was a war for the soul of Japan. The emperor was little more than a pawn, and the real power lay with whoever could control the imperial court through blood and steel. And Tomoe? She was right there, at the eye of the storm. Her lord, and some believe, her lover Minamoto no Yoshinaka, was a distant cousin to the rising power Minamoto no Yoritomo. But Yoshinaka didn't want to stand quietly in his cousin's shadow. He wanted Kyoto. He wanted control. He wanted it all. And so he marched. From the northern provinces, he raised an army and began his campaign south across rivers, through valleys, straight toward the heart of power. And at his side was Tomoe Gozen. She wasn't a figurehead. She wasn't some novelty in armor paraded before the troops for morale. Tomoe was a commander. She led men into battle. She made tactical decisions. When the swords clashed and the air filled with arrows, she was at the front, not in the rear. She became a symbol not just of Yoshinaka's boldness, but of a new kind of warrior, one who didn't wait for permission to act, one who wielded both command and courage with terrifying precision. The Genpei War was chaos incarnate. Battles weren't confined to open plains. They exploded in forests, on mountain passes, along riverbanks swollen with spring melt and death. Arrows fell like rain, and the ground turned to red mud beneath warriors' feet. In one of her most legendary moments, Tomoe led a charge at the Battle of Yokotagawara. The enemy lines collapsed beneath her ferocity. Some chronicles claim she personally beheaded several high-ranking enemy samurai and brought their heads back as proof. Not for glory, not for pride, but for proof. In a world where a woman's success would always be doubted, she knew evidence was everything. Every head was a statement, every scar a testimony. But as Yoshinaka's star rose, so did the political storm behind him. His cousin Yoritomo saw Yoshinaka's victories not as triumphs, but as threats. The Minamoto clan, already riddled with ambition and pride, began to fracture. Infighting spread. Loyalties wavered. The enemy was still the Tairabut now. Yoshinaka had to watch his own back. Tomoe remained loyal, fiercely, unwaveringly, but even the sharpest sword can't cut through political sabotage. As the war intensified, so did the dangers, not just on the field, but in the shadows behind it. In 1183, after a stunning series of victories, Yoshinaka achieved the unthinkable. He drove the Taira from Kyoto. He seized the capital. He took control of the imperial court. For a moment, he was the most powerful man in Japan. And right beside him, as always, stood Tomoe Gozen. Victorious, battle-tested, blood-stained, loyal. She had proven herself in every way a warrior could. She wasn't a novelty anymore. She was a legend in motion. But in victory, Yoshinaka's hunger for power began to alienate even his allies. His grip tightened, his paranoia deepened, and his cousin Yoritomo moved against him. The tide of war was shifting again, and Tomoe would have to make a choice that would echo through history. Victory, like a blade, is double-edged. One side gleams with power. The other slices your grip when ambition outpaces control. For Minamoto no Yoshinaka, this truth came swiftly and cruelly. His dream had been grand. Restore the emperor's authority, bring balance to the chaos of civil war, and elevate his name as the rightful power in Japan. But once inside the gilded halls of Kyoto, he proved to be more fire than reformer. He looted. He alienated. He rattled the nobles who, for all their silk and ceremony, wielded political daggers with frightening skill. Even his fellow Minamoto clansmen grew wary. The final straw? He tried to seize Emperor Go-Shirakawa, attempting to control the figurehead of Japan's spiritual and political identity. It was a move that no one could ignore. Minamoto no Yoritomo, Yoshinaka's cousin, rival, and the de facto head of the Minamoto clan, responded without hesitation. He branded Yoshinaka a traitor and dispatched two of his most trusted generals, Minamoto no Noriori and the legendary Minamoto no Yoshitsune. The Minamoto Civil War had ignited, and Tomoe Gozen now found herself not on a crusade against a common enemy, but fighting her own blood. What followed was less a campaign than a collapse. Yoshinaka, once the Lion of the North, was outmaneuvered at every turn. His power slipped through his fingers, his troops thinned. His once unbreakable position in Kyoto vanished like mist. Retreating with only a small company of loyal warriors, including Tomoe, made his final stand in the snow-covered fields of Awazu, February 1184. This was not a battle fought for conquest or strategy. This was a reckoning, a desperate grasp for honor in a war that had already passed judgment. And Tomoe? She didn't break. She didn't beg. She fought. The records describe her as a demon unleashed, rich and elegance fused into one. As enemy forces swarmed around them, Tomoe picked out the strongest samurai in the enemy ranks, charged headlong, and decapitated him in a single, elegant stroke. She didn't do it for shock. She did it to send a final, clear message. Even surrounded, even doomed, she would not be erased. But Yoshinaka knew it was over. According to legend, he turned to Tomoe and ordered her to flee not out of doubt, but to preserve his own samurai legacy. Dying beside a woman, even one as fearsome as her, would bring shame in the eyes of his enemies. It was one last twist of Ironith, woman who had stood by him in every battle, led men under his banner, and slaughtered enemies in his name, was now asked to disappear to protect his image. Some say she obeyed. Others insist she refused, choosing instead to ride into the chaos and vanish in the blood mist of war. Either way, Yoshinaka fell that day, not with a roar but a gasp. His horse bogged down in a rice field, arrows slicing through the sky, until he too was brought to earth. His loyal companion, Imi Kanahira, followed him in death by ritual suicide, leaping from horseback with his blade in his mouth. But Tomoe? That's where the myth truly begins. The snow lay thick across Awazu, the screams quieted, and history blinked. Tomoe Gozen, whose sword had danced through a dozen wars, was gone. Not Falun Gong. No one can say with certainty what became of her. And perhaps that's why her story burns so brightly, because warriors like Tomo weren't supposed to live. They were meant to fall gloriously, to bleed beneath banners, to die in perfect symmetry with honor. But Tomoe? She might have chosen the one act more radical than dying on her feet. She might have chosen to live. The Heike Monogatari, Japan's classic war epic, offers us several conflicting epilogues. In one version, she's captured by Yoritomo's men and forced to marry General Wada Yoshimori. She bears him a son, and after his death, retreats from the battlefield to become a nun, a warrior turned widow turned ghost. Another version tells a different tale, that Tomoe cut off her long hair, shed her identity, and vanished into the monasteries of Nagano, cloaking her legacy in silence. Yet another whispers that she continued to fight not for kings or clans, but as a ronin, a blade for hire. A legend wandering the borderlands, exacting quiet revenge, and dispensing justice in pockets of lawless terrain. A lone wolf in iron armor. What's certain is this: no one ever confirmed her death. There's no grave, no final scroll, no witness to her last breath. Instead, she became more than a person. She became a force, a symbol of what can't be confined by bloodlines or battlefield ranks. A woman who carved her own path through a world that told her no and then walked off that path when no one was watching. By disappearing, she became immortal. Her story outlived kingdoms. Her name, passed from court to village to temple, became part of Japan's mythic heartbeat, not because she was perfect, but because she was possible. As the dust of war settled and the shogunate rose under Yoritomo, Japan entered the Kamakura period. It was a new age, structured, patriarchal, rigid. Women like Tomoe Gozen were no longer welcomed on the battlefield. The samurai code solidified. The gate closed behind her. But her memory? It refused to stay locked inside. In the centuries that followed the fall of the Genpei War, Japan began to solidify. The samurai class crystallized into a rigid social order. Codes were written, roles were carved. And women, once battlefield archers, sword masters, and strategy advisors, were quietly pushed into the shadows. Their presence didn't disappear, but it became more myth than memory, more symbol than reality. And yet Tomoe Gozen refused to fade. Not in dusty scrolls or sanctioned chronicles, but in stories, in whispers, in the hush of mothers telling their daughters that once a woman rode into battle and dared the heavens to stop her. Around fires, soldiers spoke of her not as a ghost to be feared, but as a spirit to be respected. She was the warrior who fought like 10 men and answered to none. Time turned her into more than a memory. She became a question mark hanging over the samurai ideal, the woman who should not have existed in the warrior's world, but who thrived in it anyway. She was a paradox wrapped in armor, too skilled to ignore, too dangerous to remember truthfully. So they reshaped her. Poets, playwrights, and monks breathed life into her again, not as she was, but as they wanted her to be. A tragic heroine, a beautiful specter, a love-struck warrior, a dutiful ghost. In No and Kabuki theater, Tomoe's image returned draped not in armor, but in silk. Her sword became a metaphor. Her battles became graceful dances. Her bloodshed transformed into poetry. She wept on stage. She bid tearful farewells. She became everything an audience wanted: noble, tragic, tamed. But even within these romantic reinventions, something primal endured. Tomoe's image clung to steel. Artists of the Edo period often painted her riding full gallop into chaos, blade drawn, face composed like she'd already made peace with whatever gods were watching. Samurai training guides named her as a model of martial spirit. Sword school centuries, removed from the battlefield, invoked her as part of their lineage. She had crossed from warrior to myth, but the edge of her legend was still sharpened by truth. In modern Japan, she stands beside names like Musashi, Benkei, and Yoshitsune, but her name carries a different kind of weight. Where their legacies are tales of masculine mastery, Tomoe's is laced with rebellion. She was a warrior who shattered expectations simply by standing where she was told not to stand. She wasn't a footnote to a man's greatness. She wasn't a lover left behind. She was the one who stepped forward, sword in hand, and claimed the chaos as her own. And for every generation that came after, Tomoe stood as proof that a woman could exist outside the script, that she could lead troops, carve through ranks, and still walk away a legend. The further she drifted from historical fact, the closer she came to becoming a symbol, a woman who, by all expectations, shouldn't have existed and yet did, a fighter who wasn't erased, a story that refused to close. Tomoe Gozen's sword may have been sheathed over 800 years ago, but her presence never left. Her spirit seeped into the veins of Japan's identity, into the marrow of cultural memory. She stopped being just a character in an old war tale. She became a symbol of resistance, of selfhood, of fire hidden beneath silence. During the Edo period, as samurai culture became codified into ritual and rigidity, Tomoe's image was used in two opposing ways. To some, she was the ideal of loyalty, the warrior who never wavered, who rode until her lord fell, who remained unbroken. But to others, especially within patriarchal scholarly circles, she was a threat. A reminder of what happens when women step outside their assigned space. An anomaly, a warning. Even then, they couldn't erase her. Even those who feared her were forced to speak her name. By the time Japan entered the Meiji Restoration in the late 1800s, modernity came rushing in like a storm. The country began reshaping itself industrially, politically, culturally, and in the process of defining a national identity, Tomoe Gozen was brought back once more. But this time, she was no longer the spectral beauty of kabuki stage lights. She was a patriot. Textbooks printed her name. Children's stories recounted her bravery. School plays dressed young girls in armor and reenacted her charges. Artists paired her beside the great male heroes, not as decoration, but as an equal. The portrayals may have been softened, sanitized, stripped of the blood and dirt, but the fact remained. A woman warrior had re-entered the official canon. And then came the 20th century. The age of cinema, of comics, of literature that crossed borders. Tomoe found herself wielding blades not just in scrolls, but in manga panels, on television screens, inside video games. She was animated, digitized, stylized, sometimes loyal, sometimes haunted, sometimes tragic, sometimes ruthless. In an era packed with formulaic heroines, Tomoe stood apart. Her story didn't begin with heartbreak or end with romance. It started with steel and ended in smoke. She wasn't waiting to be saved. She rode into battle and made her own ending, however messy, however uncertain. Today, Tomoe Gozen's legacy bends with the times. To some, she's a feminist icon, proof that resistance can wear a helmet and draw blood. To others, she's a tragic warrior, forever caught between love and duty. Some portray her as a restless spirit, still stalking battlefields in search of a war that matches her fire. But in every version, she remains what she's always been: strong, enigmatic, and impossible to define. Even outside fiction, she lingers. Schools bear her name. Dojos cite her spirit in their teachings. Political speeches invoke her as a metaphor for courage and discipline. In a culture that once tried to write her out, she has become a marker of strength that refuses to be domesticated. Her image now graces everything from postage stamps to posters, from anime arcs to martial arts training halls. Tomoe Gozen, a warrior from a bygone era, has become a cultural compass. Her name is invoked whenever someone needs proof that strength, honor, and resolve are not confined to one gender or one shape. She fought one war, but her legend continues to rally across centuries wherever there's a battle for identity, dignity, or defiance. Tomoe never asked to be remembered. She didn't leave behind letters or epic poetry or neatly composed death haikus. What she left was more powerful a legacy carved in steel and fire. Every cut she made in the thick of battle wasn't just for her lord. It was a signature, a declaration, a message to the future. I was here. I mattered. That's what makes her different from the countless other women whose names have been buried in the margins of history. Tomoe wasn't remembered because she fit the mold. She was remembered because she shattered it. She wasn't preserved for embodying social ideals. She was immortalized for burning through them like a torch in the night. Every time she raised her blade in a world that told her she shouldn't, she didn't just survive. She redefined the rules. And when she disappeared into the silence after her final battle, that absence only grew louder over time. In a culture where silence often defined a woman's worth, Tomoe's silence became a roar. The lack of a confirmed ending, the vanishing without record, these weren't erasures. They were invitations, open spaces where each generation could fill in the blank with their own vision of what she meant. She has become more than a memory, more than a name. She is a vessel for possibility. A warrior who didn't ask for permission. A symbol that anyone, regardless of their station or story, can stand against the tide and carve a space for themselves. Her name lives not just in literature, but in action. In every girl who chooses grit over grace. In every athlete who pushes further. In every leader told to tone it down. Tomoe isn't a statue on a pedestal, she's a banner raised in rebellion. Today, you'll find statues of her in Nagano and other cities across Japan. School children study her in classrooms, tracing her life not as a myth but as an ancestor of courage. At anime conventions, cosplayers wear her armor. In martial arts dojos, students whisper her name during training. She has even slashed her way into video games and global cinema, not as fiction, but as the ghost of real history, refusing to die quietly. Perhaps her greatest power lies in what we still don't know. Was she a general? A foster daughter? A concubine turned commander? A fugitive who vanished into the mountains? A nun who traded her sword for silence? Maybe all. Maybe none. That's the beauty of it. Tomoe Gozen was never just one woman. She was many things, many times, in many retellings. And in a world so often desperate to categorize and confine, she remains gloriously unboxed. She isn't a story with a neat ending. She's a force eternally galloping, sword drawn into the fog of legend she wrote herself. And so, as her silhouette fades behind the snow-covered battlefield of Owazu, we turn our gaze elsewhere. But the spirit of her rebellion lingers like the last echo of war quiet but unshakable. And before satellites pierced the night sky and GPS lit our paths in blue glow comfort, there were only stars. And questions. What's out there? That was the question that gripped the earliest mariners long before maps, before compass needles danced, before humanity even learned to farm. These weren't reckless wanderers. These were scientists before science had a name. Navigators, engineers, survivalists, and dreamers who stared at a boundless horizon and chose to move toward it. Tens of thousands of years ago, before the first rice fields, before pyramids rose from sand, humans had already begun carving their place into the sea. Some of the earliest evidence of ocean travel dates back over 40 years. That's before wheels, before writing. And yet, even then, people had figured out how to leave one coastline and reach another sometimes hundreds of miles away, guided only by wind, water, and instinct. Take the earliest arrivals to what we now call Australia. They didn't stumble there by accident. They had to cross massive stretches of open ocean on-rafts crafted from ancient ingenuity. That kind of journey demands knowledge of tides, of seasonal winds, of the stars that spin overhead. These weren't accidents. These were deliberate voyages planned with methods lost to time. By 3000 BCE, waterborne travel was thriving. Along the Nile, in the riverine culture of the Indus Valley, and across Mesopotamian canals, boats ferried trade goods, fishers and farmers. But river and coast-hugging vessels were one thing. What came next was bolder, true oceanic navigation. This evolution came with risk. There were no charts, no lighthouses, no radio signals to call for help. Set out, and you might never come back. But still, they went. Because they had to. Because curiosity has always burned hotter than fear. And so, they learned. They read the sea like a language. Not just the waves, but the way clouds curled near land, the way birds flew at dusk, the way swell directions shifted after storms. They learned the sky's choreography watching Polaris stand still in the north, and the Southern Crosswheel through southern nights. With no tools beyond memory, stories, and shared rituals, these early seafarers created a knowledge system as complex and precise as any modern science. They listened to the wind in the sails. They felt the currents pull through the hull. They tracked patterns, passed them down in songs, chants, and quiet lessons whispered aboard moonlit canoes. These weren't lucky survivors. They were navigators with minds as sharp as their hand-carved paddles. And in doing so, they did more than travel. They built the foundations of the global world. They linked islands, cultures, continents. They carried seeds, stories, and strangers across water to places that had never heard of each other until a sail breached the horizon. Before Athens dreamed of democracy, before Rome claimed the Mediterranean, there was Cretan, its magnificent seafaring empire, the Minoans. Starting around 2000 BCE, the Minoans weren't just islanders, they were masters of the Aegean, architects of the sea, who treated the waters not as a boundary, but as a thoroughfare. And at the center of their ocean empire was Knossos, a city of palaces, of color, of frescoes that celebrated dolphins, ships, and the unstoppable pull of tide and time. To the Minoans, the sea wasn't just a way to get somewhere, it was a way of life. The walls of their grand palaces at Knossos weren't painted with idle imagery. The ships, dolphins, and leaping bulls weren't just decorations, they were declarations. Statements that these people lived by the tides, thrived on the water, and measured their strength not by swords, but by sails. The Minoan economy was a maritime masterpiece. Their ships fanned out across the Aegean like brushstrokes across a canvas, connecting island to island, shore to shore. From Crete, they reached Egypt, the Levant, Anatolia, bringing not just goods but influence. While later Greek ships would be designed for war, the Minoan fleet was built for grace and reach, stability, speed, diplomacy. Their vessels, often adorned with bird crests or sacred bulls, weren't floating weapons, they were floating bridges. They used square sails to harness the Mediterranean breezes and oars when the winds turned fickle. These sleek ships ferried amphorae, filled with olive oil, wine, exotic dyes, and beautifully crafted pottery. But they carried more than cargo, they carried culture. With every voyage, the Minoans exported more than material wealth. They carried with them their art, their myths, their religious symbols, their ideas. The sea was not a barrier, it was a stage. And every journey was a performance of influence. As Minoan ships reached foreign ports, they left behind echoes, frescoes, motifs, and practices that would ripple across the ancient world. But how did they find their way? No maps survive, no compasses, no logs, and yet they returned time and again. Archaeologists believe the Minoans relied on an intricate dance of observation and memory stars, guiding them through darkness, coastal silhouettes helping them orient during the day. They read the color of water like a map, watched the flight of seabirds, noticed where clouds pooled above unseen land. These weren't guesses, these were navigational systems encoded in generations of seafarers. Even without written manuals, the regular return of Minoan fleets suggests a profound understanding of seasonal winds and maritime rhythms long before anyone ever charted them. One of the most unexpected Minoan legacies comes from their cultural influence. Through their contact with Near Eastern civilizations especially, the Phoenicians, the Minoans, played a role in the development of one of the world's most important inventions, the alphabet. Through trade and transmission, ideas moved like currents. Scripts evolved, and from that evolution, the seeds of the Greek writing system would sprout. In other words, their ships were more than just transportation, they were vessels of transformation. But the sea, generous as it was, also demanded tribute. Around 1450 BCE, the Minoans met a catastrophe from the very element they had mastered. On the island of Thera, modern-day Santorini, a volcanic eruption tore the earth apart. It may have triggered devastating tsunamis, raining ash and seawater across Crete's bustling harbors. The exact cause of the Minoans' collapse is still debated: natural disaster, foreign invasion, internal unrest. But what's certain is that their ships, once the veins of Aegean power, vanished. Yet even in ruin, they left more than remnants. They left behind a blueprint of what it meant to rule not by sword, but by sea. If the Minoans were the artisans of the ocean, the Phoenicians were its tireless engineers. From around 1500 BCE to 300 BCE, this network of city-states, Tyre, Sidon, Byblostrians, formed the eastern Mediterranean into their trade empire. They didn't conquer with armies. They conquered with fleets. They had no single capital, no emperor in golden robes. What they had were ships, sleek, fast, and everywhere, vessels that skimmed across waves like messengers of commerce. Double-masted, double-rowed, reinforced for open water and coastal navigation alike. These were the true engines of an empire, made not of land, but of waves. The Phoenicians were connectors, linkers of civilizations, brokers of beauty and knowledge. They sailed between Egypt and Anatolia, Greece and Mesopotamia, ferrying cedarwood, intricately blown glass, radiant purple dye, and most importantly, ideas. With every stop, they didn't just trade goods. They laid cultural stepping stones across the Mediterranean. They founded colonies that acted like lighthouses of influence. The most famous? Carthagia, coastal city in North Africa, that would one day rise to challenge Rome itself. Each new colony became a node, a beacon in an expanding web of trade, and each returning ship ensured the mother cities of the Levant grew ever wealthier. And still, they did it all without compasses or sextants. Like the Minoans before them, the Phoenicians mastered celestial navigation. The North Star, Polaris, was their constant companion. By night, it told them which way was home. By day, they scanned the coastline, watching how currents bent around capes and how the wind whispered over the deck. Their understanding of currents, wind patterns, and coastal landmarks rivaled even later written treatises. Some scholars believe the Phoenicians created one of the first structured systems of star-based navigation in the Western world, a constellation of oral wisdom passed from sailor to sailor. But even that isn't their most powerful gift to humanity. Their greatest invention wasn't crafted from wood or bronze. It was a system made of sound. The alphabet. Developed around 1050 BCE, the Phoenician writing system reduced the complex cuneiforms and hieroglyphs of earlier civilizations into something revolutionary: 22 characters, each representing a single sound. No symbols for ideas, no pictograms for people, just pure phonetics. This was democratization by script. Suddenly, writing wasn't a divine act reserved for priests and scribes. It was practical, replicable, portable. It could be taught. It could travel. And travel it did. The Greeks adapted it. The Romans refined it. And from it, nearly every modern alphabet was born. Your keyboard today carries the genetic legacy of those ancient Phoenician trader sea-born linguists whose language could cross borders faster than their ships. So as their sails dipped beneath ancient horizons, what the Phoenicians left behind was more than a shadow on the water. They left a new way to speak, to write, to record, to remember. A people without borders, whose legacy still whispers through language itself. Their alphabet didn't rely on complex symbols or elaborate pictograms. With just 22 characters representing distinct sounds, the Phoenician script rewrote how the world communicated. And from this foundational breakthrough, an entire linguistic legacy was born on that would inspire the Greek, Latin, Hebrew, and Arabic alphabets that still shape our lives today. The Phoenicians didn't conquer empires in the traditional sense. They didn't leave behind vast armies or crumbling ruins. Instead, they left words, systems, ideas, They turned the sea from a frontier into a connection linking cultures, economies, and languages, not with the edge of a sword, but the reach of a sail. Their world was maritime, not just in practice, but in spirit. The Mediterranean wasn't an obstacle to theme, it was home, a highway, a heartbeat. But while their ships darted across the wine-dark sea of the Western world, another epic of navigation was unfolding on the other side of the planet. One far more expansive, and arguably even more astonishing. These were not the tight harbors of the Aegean or the busy ports of Phoenicia. These were the open, endless stretches of the Pacific Ocean, and navigating them were the Aranesian seafarers. They weren't just sailors, they were colonizers of the sea explorers, who settled over half of the world's ocean surface using neither maps, metal tools, nor written records. Originating from the island of Taiwan around 3000 BCE, the Aranesians slowly but purposefully began their great migration south to the Philippines and Indonesia, then eastward toward Oceania. By 1500 BCE, they had reached the shores of New Guinea. By 1000 BCE, they had spread into Micronesia and Melanesia. Over the following centuries, they stretched further still into Polynesia, as far west as Madagascar and as far east as Easter Island. A journey that spanned more than 10 miles and stitched together one of the most ambitious arcs of human expansion in history. And the vessels that carried them? Wonders of ingenuity. The Aranesians engineered outrigger canoes for balance in rough seas, brilliant solutions to the chaos of wave and wind. Later, they would perfect the double-hulled voyaging canoe, essentially floating villages, capable of holding families, livestock, crops, tools, and trade goods. Their sails, shaped like crab claws, captured wind from multiple angles. Their paddles brought them with precision into harbors hidden behind coral reefs and jungle-clad cliffs. But what truly set them apart wasn't their boats, it was their minds. The Aranesians, and especially their Polynesian descendants, developed an intuitive, sophisticated system of navigation so advanced that it still challenges modern comprehension. They didn't just look at the stars, they memorized their movements. More than 200 celestial bodies were charted in their minds, guiding them across the ocean without a single inked map. They knew how swells bounced back from distant islands. They understood how seabirds changed flight direction as land neared. They read the clouds, tasted the water for salinity, and observed how moonlight played across waves. The ocean wasn't a mystery to them, it was a living, knowable thing. This wasn't intuition. It was ancestral science, preserved not in books, but in songs, in chants, in oral traditions that encoded generations of data into rhythmic verses that trained the next navigators. It was empirical knowledge disguised as storytelling. And they didn't sail aimlessly. Their journeys were not desperate gambles. They were planned, timed, repeatable. Across the Pacific, archaeologists traced their movement through a trail of distinctive pottery, lapita, ceramics found on island after island, like markers of intentional expansion. They didn't just discover new lands. They built networks, civilizations. They carried crops, languages, religious rituals, social customs. Where they landed, they built homes, societies, identities. Across the water, they weren't just floating, they were weaving a tapestry of human connection across the planet's largest ocean. Modern DNA studies, linguistic research, and archaeology all continue to reinforce just how vast and advanced this seaborne expansion truly was. Long before European ships ever crossed the Atlantic, Aranesian navigators had already mapped and mastered the Pacific. To them, the sea wasn't a void to be feared. It was a mappa, memory etched in water and wind. But even earlier, another civilization was scripting its maritime legacy, not across an ocean, but along one of the world's most iconic rivers, the Nile. When most people think of ancient Egypt, they picture sand-swept pyramids, golden tombs, and desert dynasties, not boats. But in truth, the Egyptians were among the earliest masters of water travel. The Nile wasn't just a river, it was Egypt's bloodstream, its highway, its earliest classroom in the art of navigation. By 3000 BCE, the ancient Egyptians had already developed sizable wooden boats made from planks, tied with rope, and sealed with natural resins. These vessels, propelled by rows of oars and square sails, were vital to transporting soldiers, crops, stone, and even massive statues for temple construction. But the Egyptians didn't stop at the riverbanks. By the time of Pharaoh Hatshepsut in the 15th century BCE, they had extended their maritime reach into the Red Sea and possibly beyond. One of the most famous voyages of the ancient world was launched under her reign, bound for a mysterious land known only as Punt. Depicted in vivid reliefs at her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, this expedition showcases Egyptian ships loaded with luxury goods, gold, incense trees, exotic animals. These weren't fluke adventures. These were complex missions organized with foresight and an understanding of sea currents, monsoon winds, and trade networks. Sailing the Red Sea required skill. Egyptian navigators hugged coastlines, watched the stars, and likely enlisted experienced sailors from the Arabian and African coasts. While we lack direct Egyptian sea charts, their repeated success at such distances speaks to maritime expertise beyond the Nile's calm waters. Some researchers even speculate that Egypt may have participated in the wider Indian Ocean trade network. Goods like ivory, lapis lazuli, and spices appear in Egyptian records items common to the Indus Valley and Mesopotamian regions. Though no surviving text confirms it, these items hint at a web of trade stretching far beyond Egypt's formal borders. Whether through direct voyages or complex middlemen exchanges, the sea connected Egypt not only to its neighbors but perhaps to parts of Asia long before the Roman Empire ever dreamed of it. So while history may remember Egypt for its deserts and dynasties, the truth is that its roots were also waterbound, a civilization born not only of sand, but of sail. Egyptian ships were more than tools of transport. They were technological triumphs, constructed primarily from prized cedar wood imported from Lebanon. Their vessels showcased craftsmanship that defied their time. Curved hulls gave stability in heavy seas. Broad square sails harnessed shifting winds. And despite not becoming a naval superpower like the Phoenicians, Egypt carved out a unique legacy at Siwan, not of conquest, but of ceremony, strategy, and sacred vision. Their maritime ventures were never just economic. These journeys carried symbolism, authority, divinity. Whether it was a diplomatic mission, a trade expedition, or a spiritual pilgrimage to the mythical land of Punt, each voyage represented the extension of Egypt's influence beyond the Nile-Linto waters, once seen as uncertain and infinite. On land, they raised pyramids. On water, they launched ambition. And across the sea, another world stirred far to the east, beneath the dust and silence of modern-day Pakistan and northwest India. Long before Rome's armies or Athens' thinkers, the Harappans thrived. Known to us as the Indus Valley Civilization, the Harappans built cities that still defy our expectations. Active between 2600 and 1900 BCE, they laid out metropolises with precision grid-like street plans, standardized brick dimensions, and complex drainage systems that rival modern engineering. Their cities Mohenjo-Daro, Harappa, Dholavira weren't just settlements. They were statements of civic intelligence. But beneath the mathematical logic of their cityscapes lies a quieter story, one of sailors, traders, and seaborne vision. The Harappans were maritime people. Unlike the Egyptians, they didn't leave behind hieroglyphs glorifying their naval exploits. Unlike the Mesopotamians, they didn't carve maritime myths into stone. And unlike the Phoenicians, they didn't pass down alphabetic records of their sea routes. But they did leave something just as telling evidence in the earth. At Lothal, now a quiet archaeological site in Gujarat, India, lies what many scholars believe is one of the oldest known dockyards in human history. Measuring over 200 meters in length, it was equipped with floodgates and channels and once connected directly to an ancient river that spilled into the Arabian Sea. The structure isn't accidental. It was engineered with precision for ships, for trade, for connection. Harappan merchants didn't just dream of distant lands, they built infrastructure to reach them. Their goods tell the rest of the story. Harappan seal scarved with animals and abstract symbol shape been discovered as far west as Mesopotamia. Beads made from carnelian and agate, sculpted ivory, painted ceramics. These weren't simple exchanges. These were trade routes stretching from the Indus Basin to the heart of Sumer. Sumerian records, in turn, reference a distant seafaring land called Meluha, believed by many to be the Harappan homeland. Meluha was the source of goods both exotic and essential. In return, the Harappans received rare metals, stones, and materials: silver, tin, lapis lazuli. The trade wasn't one-sided, it was intricate, mutual, and sustained. But how did they reach across those waters? While no Harappan ships have been preserved, archaeological fragments give us clues: small-scale terracotta boat models, engraved seals showing flat-bottomed hulls, artistic impressions of masted vessels. From these, we can infer that Harappan mariners navigated both river systems and coastal routes, adapting to both inland waterways and the wider Indian Ocean. They likely hugged the coastlines, moving from estuary to estuary, stopping at natural harbors along the Arabian Sea. And like their contemporaries in Egypt and Mesopotamia, they likely relied on predictable seasonal monsoon winds, those powerful forces that would later become lifelines for generations of Indian Ocean traders. They also would have observed the stars, the tide shifts, the current behavior building, perhaps unknowingly, the earliest chapters of a navigational tradition that would stretch across empires and centuries. What's perhaps most astonishing is this: the Harappans did all this without apparent militarism. Their cities have shown almost no signs of war, no standing armies, no massive fortifications, no glorified generals etched into stone. Where others conquered with weapons, the Harappans seemed to prefer negotiation, diplomacy, and trade. Their ships weren't instruments of invasion, they were bridges. And then, around 1900 BCE, it all began to fade. The reasons are still debated: climate change, shifting river courses, economic collapse, or even disease. But gradually, the great cities fell silent. The planned streets filled with dust. The ports emptied. The dock at Lothal dried and cracked. And yet, their influence remained scattered across ancient coastlines, embedded in goods that still baffle archaeologists, whispered in the language roots of those who followed. The Harappans didn't leave behind epic tales of war heroes or divine kings, but in the rustle of sails and the clink of trade goods changing hands on distant shores, their legacy is still there, quiet but enduring. They were not warriors. They were weavers of trade routes, of culture, of one of the world's earliest truly connected economies. Their story, like so many others told through the language of waves, is not just about where they sailed. It's about how far we've come in wood, on wind, on memory. Civilizations rise on rivers, but they can fall with them too. For the ancient Harappans of the Indus Valley, it wasn't war or invasion that brought silence to their cities, but a quieter foe: nature. As rivers shifted courses and monsoon patterns grew erratic, the lifeblood of Harappan trade began to wither. Maritime routes emptied. Docks fell idle. Great cities, once teeming with trade and ritual, were slowly abandoned. Their undeciphered script, carved onto seals and tablets, faded into mystery, along with them leaving behind one burning question: just how far did their ships sail? We may never hear their voices, but their ocean trail remains etched into ancient ports, carved seals, and the bones of forgotten harbors. The Harappans are gone, but the water remembers. Centuries later, across the restless waves of the Mediterranean, a new chapter in humanity's maritime story began out with silence, but with song. To the ancient Greeks, the sea wasn't just geography. It was fate. Born into a cradle of salt water flanked by the Aegean, Ionian, and Mediterranean, they didn't merely live beside the sea, they lived through it. From the earliest myths of serpents and shipwrecks to the tactical brilliance of Athenian naval warfare, Greek civilization unfolded like a map charted in foam and wind. Their epic poems like Homer's tales of Odysseus outwitting monsters on storm-tossed seas or Jason chasing myth across the waves weren't just allegories. They were echoes of reality, wrapped in mythic armor. And if you wanted to understand the Greeks, you followed their ships. City-states like Athens, Corinth, and Rhodes weren't built in isolation. They were nodes in a watery network linked by sea lanes, trade winds, and cultural currents. For the Greeks, the sea didn't separate, it connected. Their gods ruled the waves. Their heroes conquered them. Their cities relied on ships, the way modern nations rely on internet, cable civery, olive jar, amphora, and bolt of linen, part of a global circuit. By the 8th century BCE, Greek colonists were scattering like seeds across the Mediterranean. They founded settlements in Sicily, Italy, North Africa, and even along the Black Sea coast. These weren't military garrisons, they were vibrant port cities, cultural outposts that carried language, art, and religion across the waters. In exchange, they brought home grain from Egypt, tin from Iberia, furs from the Caucasus, and slaves from everywhere in between. Their ships didn't just float, they flowed, outward and inward, forever moving. And how did they find their way? Greek mariners relied on coastal landmarks. Yes, but they also mastered the stars. The rising and setting of specific constellations became celestial road signs. Knowledge wasn't written, it was spoken, taught from sailor to sailor like an inheritance. They tracked bird flights, watercolor, wind direction. They navigated with rhythm and instinct, turning the Mediterranean into their classroom. But trade was just the beginning. By the 5th century BCE, the sea had become a battlefield, and the Greeks, masters of its warfare. Enter the trireme, sleek, fast, lethal. A 3-tiered galley, rowed by 170 men and tipped with a bronze ram, the trireme wasn't just a warship. It was a floating embodiment of Athenian ambition. A symbol of democracy because every rower was a citizen, every oar stroke a heartbeat of the city-state. At its peak, Athens ruled the waves. Through the Delian Ligaea, so-called defensive alliance against Persia, that quickly became an empire in disguise, Athens controlled key sea routes, demanded tribute, and funneled wealth back home to fund its golden age. Philosophy, architecture, drama known of it would have been possible without naval dominance. But with sea power came risk. The Peloponnesian War against Sparta turned Athens' strength into its Achilles' heel. Naval blockades choked trade. Fleet losses shattered morale. Internal strife cracked the city's foundation. In the end, the very waters that had lifted Athens into legend helped pull it under. Yet the Greeks left a mark that would ripple far beyond their shores. Their innovations in geography, astronomy, and ship design became the blueprint for Romance. Centuries later, Europe's maritime age. The Greeks saw the sea not as a void to be feared, but as a theater of possibility, for glory, for knowledge, for tragedy. And while the Greeks wrote the playbook for seafaring courage, it was the Romans who turned the sea into an empire. Rome didn't start as a naval power. In fact, early Rome was a landlocked underdog, looking enviously at the coastlines dominated by others. The Etruscans ruled the Italian shores. The Greeks had the eastern Mediterranean, and in the west, a new titan was rising, Carthage, founded by Phoenician settlers, with a navy that could blot out the horizon. Rome didn't match that power, they reverse-engineered it. During the brutal Punic Wars, faced with the full might of Carthage's fleet, the Romans captured a single enemy warship and turned it into a prototype. In months, they churned out hundreds more. But Rome being Rome, they didn't stop there. They added the Corvusa boarding bridge that turned sea battles into infantry fights. Suddenly, naval combat became Roman territory. Instead of fighting from ships, Roman soldiers fought onto them. They stormed enemy decks like they were storming city walls. The Corvus flipped the rules of warand, flipped Carthage's fortune along with it. By the end of the Second Punic War, Rome had stripped Carthage of its empire. Sicily, Sardinia, Spain, and eventually all of North Africa fell under Roman control. The Mediterranean, a chaotic mix of rival navies and independent traders, became a Roman lake. They called it Mare Nostrum, our sea. Rome's dominance wasn't just about conquest, it was about connection. Grain from Egypt, gold from Hispania, slaves from Gaul, spices from the East all moved on Roman ships, protected by Roman fleets, for Roman consumption. And it worked, for a time. Roads might have linked Rome's provinces, but its heart pulsed on water. Still, the sea gives and the sea tests. Storms struck, pirates rose, enemies adapted. And eventually, Rome, like every great power, before and after learned that even the strongest fleet can't sail against history forever. But the legacy remained. From the river-bound Harappans to the myth-driven Greeks to the conquest-hungry Romans, every ancient people that touched the sea left something behind. A method, a ship design, a story. The ocean became not just a space between nations, but the thing that shaped them. Through shipwrecks and sailing songs, trade routes and warpaths, the sea carved civilization into shape. And through it, all waves crashed, stars wheeled overhead, and somewhere, out on the edge of the known world, a sailor looked at the horizon and asked the same question his ancestors whispered. What's out there? The Roman Empire didn't just sprawl across continents, it flowed across waves. As its legions marched on dusty roads, an equally powerful force surged across the seas, the Roman fleet. These ships didn't just transport goods, they hauled the ambitions of an empire. Along bustling ports like Ostia and Alexandria, sails flapped like imperial banners. Dockworkers shouted across piers, crates thudded onto gangways, and spices, scrolls, slaves, and silks moved like blood through the arteries of Rome's maritime network. The Mediterranean, once a maelstrom of pirate-infested waters and rival kingdoms, had been tamed, claimed, and transformed into what Rome proudly dubbed Mare Nostrum Sea. It was no hollow boast. This aquatic highway fueled the Pax Romana rare window of peace, lasting nearly 2 centuries. Grain from Egypt fed the hungry mouths of the capital. Wine and olive oil flowed in amphorae from Hispania. From distant India and China came silk, gemstones, and perfume luxuries that once seemed as mythical as dragons. But this wasn't some blind miracle of nature. It was engineering, strategy, vision. Roman sailors didn't have GPS, sonar, or even compasses, yet they mastered a rhythm of the sea. Through dead reckoning, they estimated their position by speed and direction. They hugged coastlines, noted landmarks, read wind swells, and used the stars like signposts, their version of Google Maps. Ancient sea guides, known as periploi hand-copied scrolls, that laid out sailing directions like a sailor's secret spellbook. They understood seasonal shifts like the Attic winds in the eastern Mediterranean, which made planning return voyages a precise science. Through trial, failure, and centuries of observation, they mapped the mood of the sea. The result? A logistics network so vast, so efficient, that it kept an empire of 70 million people running. It wasn't just trade, it was control. Roman warships patrolled sea lanes, crushing piracy and enforcing imperial order. Communication across thousands of kilometers became reliable. Orders from emperors could reach distant governors faster than messages on land. The sea became Rome's fastest messenger. Think about that for a moment. Centuries before the first compass needle quivered or a steamship belched smoke, Rome turned the sea into a superhighway. A web of wooden ships, iron discipline, and starlit navigation held together what was, for a time, the most complex civilization on Earth. They weren't alone. Long before the Romans carved their empire into stone, the oceans had already been claimed by others. In truth, the entire ancient world was crisscrossed by an invisible threadwork of maritime routes, not drawn on parchment, but in wind, memory, and the stars. From the slender reed boats of the Nile to the massive double-hulled canoes of the Pacific, humanity had already been at sea for millennia, weaving a silent web of connection. These early mariners didn't stumble blindly into the waves. They defined them, and that definition still lingers. It echoes every time a container ship slides into port, every time a sea lane is patrolled by radar-guided vessels. Every time a satellite tracks a cargo freighter on the open ocean, the legacy of those ancient navigators shaft forgotten, often anonymous still, lives in every knot and compass rose. Take the Minoans, for example, those sea-dancing artisans of Crete. They didn't just trade pottery and perfume. They spread architecture, writing systems, and religion across the Aegean. Or the Phoenicians, those tireless middlemen of the Mediterranean, who stitched together east and west with cedar ships and invented alphabets along the way. The Aranesians' Polynesia's seafaring genius read ocean swells, like Braille, sensing islands thousands of miles away with no metal, no maps, and no written records. They left traces across half the planet. Egyptian expeditions to the land of Punt show that pharaohs didn't just build pyramids, they launched fleets. They navigated monsoon winds, tracked stars over the Red Sea, and brought back incense trees and gold. Even the Harappans' quiet engineers of the Indus Valley built dockyards and sent goods to distant Mesopotamian ports long before Greek colonies touched Italy's shores. These cultures weren't isolated, they were cumulative. Every era built upon the echoes of the last. The Phoenicians handed us a script so efficient, it seeded the alphabets of Greek, Latin, Hebrew, and Arabic. Their simplified writing wasn't just a way to mark goods. It was a catalyst for recorded history itself. The Aranesians passed navigation techniques, orally chanting star paths and current patterns to the next generation. In the 20th century, when traditional wayfinding began to vanish, revivalists had to rediscover what these ancient seafarers had always known: that you can cross oceans without a compass if you understand the language of waves. The Greeks mapped stars and named winds, birthing ancient geography as both a science and a philosophy. The Romans, obsessed with order, turned that abstract knowledge into concrete achievements: ports, lighthouses, and shipping schedules that mirrored modern logistics. Even today, harbors echo their legacy. Architectural layouts trace Roman dockyards. Signal towers mimic ancient watchposts. The language of the sea, its rhythms and rituals, bears ancient fingerprints. But maybe the most important gift of these maritime pioneers wasn't the hardware. It was the connections they forged. The sea didn't just move olive oil and obsidian. It moved ideas, technology, crops, stories, beliefs. Religion spread by boat long before missionaries walked dusty trails. Buddhism sailed eastward from India. Christianity crossed the Mediterranean. Islam traveled the Indian Ocean, riding monsoon winds. Wherever sails reached, so did gods, prayers, and philosophies. So did disease, so did medicine, so did revolution. The sea wasn't just a marketplace. It was a petri dish of civilization. And yet, amid this sweeping grandeur, a sobering truth: we remember the emperors, the philosophers, the generals, but the sailors, the builders, the navigators who dared leave shore and vanish over the horizon? Their names are mostly lost. They left no memoirs, no statues, no epics in their honor. What we have are fragments: a seal found in a Mesopotamian ruin traced back to the Indus, a shard of pottery buried beneath centuries of silt, a mooring stone unearthed beneath a modern dock, a story, half whispered in coral and wind. But their legacy moves still hidden in cargo holds, sung in shipping lanes, buried in the shape of every hull that braves the ocean. So the next time you see a freighter pass on the horizon, or watch a ship sail into port, know this: you're not just seeing a machine. You're seeing a ghosted descendant of the very first sailor who looked at the stars, felt the wind in their face, and whispered the ancient question that launched us into the deep: what if we don't turn back? In the cradle of antiquity, being born into royalty wasn't a fairy tale, it was a tightrope walk over a pit of vipers. The moment a child drew their first breath within palace walls, they were no longer simply human. They became a banner, a political pawn, a name inscribed on future history, sometimes in ink, sometimes in blood. Their nursery wasn't lined with lullabies, it echoed with dynasty, danger, and expectation. While the average child might have learned survival by fetching water or tending goats, royal offspring were thrust into a very different crucible. From their earliest days, They were taught that every movement, every glance, every hesitation could one day change the fate of kingdoms. Imagine growing up where a giggle could be scrutinized for weakness, and a stumble could be whispered about in the court like an omen. Their lives weren't theirs. They were rehearsals constant, relentless preparation for crowns they hadn't earned, for wars they hadn't declared, and for rivalries they hadn't started. Reading? That wasn't for fairy tales or bedtime fables. Royal children learned to read so they could interpret border treaties, taxation decrees, and edicts laced with double meanings. Speaking? Not for idle chatter. Every word they uttered was fine-tuned to command obedience, to mask threats in velvet, and to flatter with venom-coated charm. What they learned and how they learned, it depended on where their cradle sat on the map. In the scorching libraries of Babylon, a future monarch might be taught cuneiform and arithmetic under the watchful gaze of scribes who recorded every hesitation. In the echoing halls of a Theban temple, an Egyptian heir would decode the secrets of the gods in hieroglyphs, instructed by priests who whispered like wind through papyrus scrolls. In Greece, they'd argue logic and ethics before they could even hold a sword. In Persia, they'd learn to ride, hunt, and crush rebellion all while perfecting the art of dining like a king. In ancient China, education was steeped in Confucian ideals, filial piety, cosmic balance, and bureaucratic discipline woven into every lesson. Power wasn't inherited, it was cultivated, ritualized, and reinforced through centuries of precision. And even their playtime was a tutorial in power. Their toys weren't dolls and wooden swords, they were miniature tools of statecraft. Painted warriors lined their game boards, modeling battlefield tactics. Puzzle boxes trained patience and cunning. Animal figurines didn't represent pets. They were symbols of lions for dominance, cranes for wisdom, serpents for danger. Nothing was innocent. Their tutors? Far more than glorified babysitters. These mentors were equal parts drill sergeant, courtier, and disposable asset. Chosen for loyalty and stature, they were often members of minor noble families, educated enough to instruct, loyal enough not to scheme, and expendable enough to be blamed. Because make no mistake, if the child stumbled, faltered, or failed to rise to the expectations carved into their name, the tutor vanished, sometimes exiled, sometimes executed. A prince or princess wasn't just the hope of the realm. They were its insurance policy, and no one forgives a broken policy. To train a royal was to walk the blade's edge between reverence and sacrifice. This education was not about nurturing potential, it was about ensuring obedience, enforcing legacy, and above all, securing the regime. These children weren't taught to think freely. They were sculpted into the continuation of dynasties, into living, breathing extensions of their ruling bloodlines. Every lesson carried the weight of national survival. But amid this iron-willed structure, there was brilliance breathtaking, intimidating brilliance. These royal children didn't just memorize treaties. They studied the stars, performed complex surgeries on scrolls before they ever cut a man, and spoke 3, 4, sometimes 5 languages before adolescence. Theirs was a crash course in being god kings, emperor scholars, philosopher generals. By the time most children mastered the art of not tripping over their own feet, these heirs could quote ancient law and summon armies with a gesture. It wasn't all war and wisdom, though. Some royal households, like those in Hellenistic Greece or Tang China, valued music, poetry, and visual arts as proof of refinement. A prince who couldn't recite verse or play the lute was seen as lacking humanity. A princess who couldn't compose poetry was deemed unworthy of diplomacy. Culture wasn't ornamental, it was weaponized charisma. In royal courts across time and continent, schooling was an arms race of the mind. Picture this: a child who can match a senator in debate before reaching puberty. A girl taught how to bend political alliances through a wedding vow. A boy who could read the stars for omens and the expressions of courtiers for lies. Childhood wasn't gentle, it was preparation for psychological warfare. Of course, there were exceptions. Some royal scions rejected this path either by rebellion or disinterest. Some cracked under pressure. Some turned into tyrants. Others escaped to monasteries or exile, refusing the role carved for them. But many, perhaps too many, fulfilled their purpose. And when they did, the world bowed. Take Crown Prince Amri of the kingdom once perched near the Zagros Mountains. Raised under the iron-fisted doctrine of three empires, Amri's daily studies included 6 hours of ancient law, 3 of state economics, and archery practice at dawn. By age 15, he presided over trials. By 17, he led a campaign against rebel hill clans and wrote poetry that priests memorized like scripture. His childhood wasn't stolen, it was weaponized. Or Princess Lian of the Pearl Dynasty, who was forbidden to leave her compound until her 12th year, but knew more about military logistics than her father's generals. Her toys were bronze models of supply lines. Her lullabies were battlefield reports. She became a master of shadow diplomacy, ruling empires through letters sealed with silk and secrets. These weren't rare flukes. These were the logical outcomes of a system that bred legacy as seriously as it bred crops. Every continent had its version. Every kingdom its child forged in gold and fear. In Rome, a young Caesar might train with philosophers before being marched through military drills. In Kush, a queen's son would be educated by priest kings in theology and metallurgy. In Mesoamerica, an Aztec heir would study calendars, war chants, and the terrifying math of ritual sacrifice. There was no escape from expectation-only excellence, exile, or execution. And yet, it wasn't all cruelty. There were quiet moments when a teacher shared a story of fallen rulers to scare or inspire, when a young prince asked why borders mattered, when a daughter of empire wrote poems about birds in cages that mirrored her own heart. These moments rarely made it into records, but they were there, glimpses of the child beneath the crown. By the time these heirs came of age, they were less people and more performance. But what a performance it was! Royal education in the ancient world wasn't about degrees, it was about destiny. You weren't raised for a career, you were raised for a crown, for war, for alliances that would decide the lives of thousands. You were raised to represent gods on Earthor, at least pretend you did. And if you failed, there were no makeup exams, just succession plots, or poison, or political erasure. The paradox of royal childhood was brutal and brilliant. It created some of the most capable minds in history, while demanding they never forget they were tools, not individuals. Even now, thousands of years later, echoes of that system linger. When children of power are groomed for office, tutored in private, taught to smile in front of cameras, and bear the weight of family namesits, just a modern mask on an ancient pattern. The faces change, the palaces modernize, but the education of royalty remains the same. Equal parts, privilege, prison, and prophecy. So the next time you hear a tale of a mighty ruler or general who never lost, a queen who shaped continents, a boy king who rose too fast, remember the classroom that made them. Not a desk and chalkboard, but a throne in training. To be born with a crown above your cradle in the ancient world wasn't a stroke of luck, it was a lifelong test dressed as a birthright. You weren't raised, you were molded. Your first cries weren't met with lullabies, but with calculations, alliances, and expectations. Your life began not as a child, but as a blueprint for control. And in the shadows of every would-be king or queen, behind every great reign or catastrophic fall, stood a figure you won't often find on coins or statuettes, the royal tutor. These weren't glorified babysitters or kindly old scribes with patience and a scroll. Nothese were the hidden architects of empire, priests, philosophers, generals, spies. Their mission? To forge a ruler from a child's mind. Not just a competent leader, but a magnetic one, a symbol, a weapon, sometimes even a living god. Among the most thunderous tutor-student pairings in history was that of Master Lyran of Andragos and Prince Caelus the Radiant. Chosen by King Thalos the Hammer to educate his unpredictable heir, Lyran was a philosopher warrior equal parts steel and syllogism. His lessons ranged from battlefield geometry to metaphysical riddles. Under his mentorship, Caius didn't just learn to win wars, learned to reshape the very myths of leadership. Sound familiar? That's because this pairing was mirrored in our own world by Aristotle and Alexander the Great. King Philip of Macedon summoned the greatest philosopher of his age not to fill his son's head with dusty logic, but to weaponize his intellect. Aristotle poured into young Alexander a fire not of conquest, but of inquiry. The result? A ruler who conquered not just land, but mind sand, carried scrolls of Homer beside his sword. But not every prodigy listens. Fast forward to the Roman court Nero, raised by the Stoic philosopher Lucius Seneca, who tried desperately to fill the boy with virtue, restraint, and wisdom. For a time, it worked. But palace intrigue, bloodline paranoia, and unchecked ambition unraveled everything. Nero didn't become a philosopher king, he became a pyromaniac tyrant. A flaming counterargument to the idea that education always succeeds. And Seneca? He died by imperial command for suicide. Because being a royal tutor wasn't just an honor, it was a gamble. If your pupil failed, you burned with them. In the Persian Empire, education of the elite was almost militarized. Young heirs of the Asharkan dynasty based loosely on the Achaemenid sphere, trained by seasoned field generals. The curriculum was raw: archery at dawn, horse mastery by midday, and the ethics of justice at dusk. These boys weren't allowed to lie. They weren't allowed to cry. They were carved into command, layer by brutal layer. Every mistake was punished not with rebuke, but with shame. Honor was learned like swordplay. One slip, and you bled. Meanwhile, in the far courts of the Shennong Empyrean, ancient mirror of classical China Confucian scholars, shaped emperors through ink and incense. They taught etiquette that could rival algebra in complexity. Rituals that guided everything from how a prince stood in court to how he wept at funerals. But tutors here lived dangerously too. One wrong doctrine, one deviation from the celestial order, and you weren't simply dismissed. You were erased along with your family. These mentors had to tread impossible lines, brilliant but invisible, strict but loving, powerful yet silent. Too successful, and they invited envy. Too cautious, and they were seen as weak. Their legacy lived or died entirely through the success of their pupil. For commoners, education came from the grind of daily survival, but in the palaces, it was systematized. Hidden chambers, private monasteries, temple academies, knowledge was hoarded like treasure and doled out like ritual. This wasn't school, it was transformation. In the tomb-silent schools of ancient Karadesh, modeled after Egypt's New Kingdom future, pharaohs were educated not just in leadership, but in divinity. Literacy wasn't a public rite. It was priestly magic. A prince would memorize spells, study celestial alignments, and learn to command the afterlife. Mathematics wasn't for trade aid, was for pyramid building. Medicine wasn't healing jit, was sacred alchemy. These boys were taught to rule with a hand touched by the gods and sealed in gold. This knowledge wasn't broadcast, it was encrypted, hidden inside temples, behind papyrus curtains, passed from high priest to heir like an incantation. To read hieroglyphs was to hold power. To know the stars was to bend fate. Persia's elite also knew secrecy. Herodotus once described the king's school, a hidden enclave where noble sons learned to wield arrows, words, and truth in equal measure. Here, you didn't graduate. You emerged ready to command armies and provinces often, without having seen the wider world. That was the point. You weren't bred for the people, you were bred above them. In the forests of early Bharatananchan India, royal students attended gurukuls, sacred forest academies run by sages. Picture a prince kneeling in humility beside the son of a merchant, both repeating Sanskrit hymns while surrounded by tigers and incense smoke. The guru didn't teach for gold. He taught for transformation. Lessons included philosophy, weaponry, astronomy, and martial ethics, and always obedience. The training wasn't gentle. The lessons weren't optional, because a future king wasn't allowed to just lead, he had to deserve it. Even their downtime was a continuation of instruction. Games weren't idle. They were simulations of battle formations, negotiation tactics, and judicial decisions. Toys taught hierarchy. Storytelling taught diplomacy. Everything served the throne. And their tutors? Living paradoxes. They had to be geniuses without ambition, mentors without personal glory, and guards of knowledge who never made it into the tales. Most of them didn't get statues. They didn't get songs. They got blamed, replaced, or at best forgotten, unless their students changed the world. Even then, the credit went up the food chain. You think of Alexander, not Aristotle. You remember Nero, not Seneca. But behind every title conqueror, lawgiver, divina, there's a teacher in the shadows who carved the mind behind the throne. And if that child stumbled, if the golden heir faltered, fell, or turned monstrous, well, then it was the tutor's head that rolled first. In the ancient world, knowledge wasn't a gift, it was a gate, and only those born under the right roof, with the right blood, could even approach it. Education didn't just shape destiny, it was destiny. It carved kings out of children, queens out of girls, and forged minds into weapons sharper than any sword. In places like Helion, a fictional mirror of Greece, learning was said to elevate the soul, but not all souls were treated equally. Even in the city-states with the most open educational ideals, like Kydros or Laphon, inspired by Sparta and Athens, only the children of the elite truly tasted structured learning. In Kydros, royal sons were whisked into a brutal academy known as the Achen part boot camp, part brain forge. In Laphon, aristocrats brought in personal mentors who drilled their children in logic, warfare, and politics from an early age. After all, winning a war meant nothing if you couldn't win the debate after it. But even then, this knowledge was never freely given. It was passed down like a sacred blade, reserved for those who could wield it without letting it fall into chaos. And what of the royal daughters? They weren't just dressed up to be seen, they were trained to be used, not as soldiers, as strategists. In the kingdom of Almatron, Echo of ancient Egypt, queens didn't just exist beside kings. They ruled temples, brokered deals, and managed empires in their own right. Women like Queen Hatari and Seraphi, reimagined from Hatshepsut and Nefertiti, weren't silent shadows. They governed, they led rituals, and they negotiated peace across battle lines. To do this, they had to be more than beautiful, they had to be brilliant. Princesses were often educated by temple scholars in secret wings of the capital sanctuaries. They learned to read the divine script, perform sacred ceremonies, manage wealth, and speak the coded language of statecraft. Some were inducted as brides of the sun, an elite priestess order where theology, politics, and magic merged into one powerful toolkit. Their education wasn't ornamental. It was calculated, measured in political leverage and diplomatic leverage. Their knowledge gave them teeth when swords were too loud. In the courts of the Larkin Empire, a reflection of ancient Persia, royal women were tucked away behind gilded curtains, but their minds traveled freely through scrolls, ledgers, and hushed strategy sessions. Queens like Atisha and Maria were not idle silk-draped ornaments. They oversaw trade caravans, ran sprawling estates, and forged backroom alliances that changed the tides of war. To manage such domains, they had to be taught mathematics, negotiation, protocol, and most importantly, when to speak and when to listen. Greek historians like Xenarchos, who visited Larkin, noted how women wielded invisible power not by being seen, but by knowing everything that happened behind the throne. In Helion, the contrast was sharp. In cities like Laphon, Athens, women, regardless of status, were mostly given a domestic education: music, weaving, household accounts, and basic literacy. Enough to be graceful, not enough to be dangerous. But in Kydros, Sparta, it was a different game entirely. There, royal women were raised in fire. They trained in physical strength, public oration, and civic responsibility. A Kydron princess could run an estate, oversee military matters in her husband's absence, and deliver public addresses that put some generals to shame. And when wars claimed the men, it was the women who kept the warrior culture alive. In the eastern realms of Bharata and Zhong, inspired by India and China, royal women were taught within the boundaries of religion, dynasty, and decorum, but that didn't mean they were unarmed. During the golden era of the Varaha dynasty, mirroring the Guptas, royal daughters like Princess Yashira were educated in Sanskrit poetry, music, religious texts, and state rituals. Their intelligence enhanced their desirability, but also quietly gave them power. In some cases, these women went on to become regents and advisors, exercising political influence from behind the veils of custom. Meanwhile, in the dragon courts of Zhong, noble women were raised on a steady diet of calligraphy, Confucian morality, and court protocol. But those destined for true power like Empress Luan and Wuzaware also schooled in surveillance, political psychology, and diplomatic chess. They didn't scream to be heard, they whispered in the right ears. Education in these palaces was a veil. What looked like etiquette was often espionage in disguise. Across all these ancient kingdoms, one theme remained constant. Language was power. Swords might win battles, but words won empires. The ability to speak with elegance, provoke emotion, and sway crowds wasn't a luxury skill, it was an arsenal. Young nobles weren't merely taught to read and write, they were trained to perform. In Helion, rhetoric was the soul of leadership. Aristocratic youth studied under orators like Dicicles and Metrion, stand-ins for Isocrates and the Sophists, where speechcraft was dissected like science. They mastered the balance of logos, ethos, and pathos, logic, credibility, and emotion. In forums, they debated laws. In assemblies, they spoke for policies. In courts, they argued for lives. If you couldn't move a crowd, you didn't deserve to lead one. This obsession with rhetoric migrated west. In the Roman Empire, a stand-in for Rome, elite boys began speech training as early as age 6. They memorized the thunderous proclamations of great orators, practiced court argumentation, and drilled delivery while maintaining stoic control. Cicero wasn't just a hero, was a curriculum. And this wasn't just about politics. It was about survival. A single word said wrong in court could lead to assassination. A pause in judgment could topple a senate. In this world, the tongue was as sharp as the dagger and often more lethal. The children of rulers were taught to hold an audience the way a swordsman holds a blade, with tension, focus, and perfect control. And if you thought this was reserved only for boys, think again. In Kydros, women trained in oration could inherit lands and influence votes. In Bharata, royal princesses were tasked with giving temple speeches. In Zhong, consorts delivered formal petitions before the emperor himself, each word calculated. Each inflection weighed for political consequence. Language, in these cases, wasn't a communication tool. It was a key to control perception, shape destiny, and maintain power without ever lifting a blade. From fire-wrought academies to silk-draped courtyards, ancient education was never neutral. It was designed to mold, to control, and to predict. And whether you were raised to swing a sword, write a treaty, or sway a kingdom with a single speech, your mind was your first battlefield. Some were raised to command, others to obey. But the truly dangerous ones? They were taught to do both and choose which when it mattered most. What if I told you the greatest weapon in ancient power games wasn't a sword, but a sentence? That a single well-placed phrase could end dynasties, win empires, or save a life. In the gilded palaces of antiquity, survival wasn't always about strength, it was about speech. For those born into crowns and consequence, mastering language was a matter of life and legacy. In the golden halls of Nylene, the sun god's chosen rulers were trained not just to command armies, but to command attention. Every word the monarch uttered carried spiritual and legal authority. Children of the crown learned ancient ceremonial phrases, the way commoners learned lullabies, through ritual, repetition, and awe. When the king spoke during temple processions or New Year ceremonies, it wasn't a speech. It was law chanted into reality. Meanwhile, In the sandstone cities of Balhurawat, we know as Mesopotamia elite schools weren't teaching children how to write grocery lists. They were crafting diplomats with ink and clay. Young nobles learned the art of persuasive tablet writing, royal decrees etched in cuneiform, intricate hymns to their deities, and letters that could either provoke war or promise peace. In faraway Parava, now ancient Persia, language was a battlefield of its own. Heirs to the fire throne were drilled in not one, but many tongues. Old Paravic for ceremony, Aramoic for politics, even foreign languages like Hellenic Greek for international dealings. Princes were expected to know how to flatter a rival, charm an ally, or intimidate an audience hall without drawing their sword. Across the blue rivers of early Bharat, royal disciples absorbed ancient verse and cunning strategy. Their classrooms echoed with Sanskrit recitations of the Arthashastra manual of espionage, rhetoric, and statecraft. In a world where silence could be seen as weakness, a silver tongue was armor, and language itself was a weapon forged from thought. Among the forested frontiers of the Celtic and Varganic tribes, storytelling was the seat of power. No crown was needed, just a voice. Leaders were expected to move hearts, command tribes, and shape legacy through tale and tone. If a prince stuttered, he stumbled toward irrelevance. Because in every kingdom, from misty marshlands to golden dunes, power wasn't seized, it was spoken into existence. But language wasn't the only code of kings. Look to the sky. What do you see? The ancients saw more than stars. They saw messagestimatables, divine scripts, maps drawn in fire. For the world's royal elite, the heavens were not poetic, they were practical. Long before calculus, in the temple towers of Sumeria, the elite studied with priest astronomers. Young royals didn't gaze at the stars for wonder. They calculated lunar eclipses, interpreted omens, and used advanced base 60 math to divine when to crown a king or declare a campaign. A misreading of the stars could doom an empire. Over in Nilene, under the shadow of stone pyramids, the future pharaohs were taught to measure flooded lands for taxation, align temples with constellations, and design monoliths with precise geometric principles. The rising of the star Sopdet marked their new year, not just a celebration, but the rhythm of empire. In Arya-Vartancient, India knowledge was equal parts sacred and scientific. From the sultry scrolls of the Sulba Sutras to the cosmic insights of Aryabhata, young royals absorbed lessons in algebra, astronomy, and spiritual math. Numbers weren't neutral. They governed the cosmos, anchored rituals, and empowered kings. Across the Hellenic Isles, numbers meant philosophy. For the sons of Macedon, arithmetic wasn't just schoolwork, it was statecraft. Teachers like Aristocles, you'd know him as Plato, taught that geometry revealed the universe's balance and, therefore, a ruler's role in it. Understanding the stars was to understand destiny. Even in the jade courts of early Xi'an, math and astronomy were core curriculum. The emperors were regarded as celestial mediatorshevans chosen. Their ability to predict eclipses or align calendars validated their divine status. Young heirs were trained by court astronomers to track lunar cycles and reform calendars, because even time had to obey the throne. But celestial knowledge was only one half of a ruler's might. Books might grant the right to rule, but blades preserved it. In ancient palaces, education didn't end with scrollsit, it began with steel. The battlefields of nobility weren't metaphors. They were reality. And no amount of philosophy could replace the sting of a missed parry. In the harsh warrior state of Dracoria, mirroring Sparta, royal sons entered the Stonehold Academy at age 7. There, princes were no different from soldiers. They trained in endurance, hand-to-hand combat, pain tolerance, and battlefield tactics. Friendships were forged in bruises, loyalty in blood. In the eastern highlands of Parava, nobility followed the 3 commandments of martial education. Ride with precision, draw the bow with honor, speak only truth. Hunting wasn't sporty, it was training for war. And a prince who couldn't shoot an arrow straight had no business on a throne. On the sunlit plains of Sindhura, the warrior castes prepared heirs through Dhanurvedathe, science of war. They wielded spears, swung maces, and shot arrows while reciting passages from the Mahabharata. The epics weren't just mythology, they were moral textbooks, outlining the codes of courage, justice, and sacrifice. In the twin river valleys of Assyria and Elam, royalty practiced chariot warfare, spearmanship, and wrestling. The pharaohs didn't just pose with smiting sticks, they trained under seasoned generals. Their battlefield image was earned through bruises, not pageantry. And in golden Roma, the sons of senators and emperors learned to be men of valor. They sparred with wooden blades, studied the great military campaigns of Scipio and Camillus, and trained in formations that mirrored real battlefield tactics. Julius Caesar's name, reshaped in our version of history, wasn't just a literary prodigy. He was a soldier before he became a sovereign. Across all these lands, one truth held. A ruler who couldn't fight didn't just risk losing a war. They risked losing the loyalty of their people. This wasn't an era of figureheads. It was an age of flesh and blood monarchs, whose brains and blades had to work in tandem. From syllables to swords, from scrolls to spear-sanctioned royal education was not a privilege. It was an unforgiving crucible. It forged philosopher kings and warrior queens, cunning diplomats and cold-eyed generals. And what bound them all wasn't just bloodline. It was preparation. Ruthless, relentless, regal preparation. Crown, crucible. The final test of ancient power. Imagine growing up knowing that the wrong glance could start a war, that your silence could be misread as treason, that every meal, every bow, every breath could either protect or doom your dynasty. This wasn't childhood. This was survival school royal edition. While scholars argue over who had the best armor or the fiercest armies, they often overlook the most treacherous battlefield of all, the court. In the shimmering palaces of ancient dynasties, etiquette wasn't decoration. It was strategy dressed in silk. In the vast marble halls of Genoa's empire, mirror to Han China young heirs weren't simply playing with wooden toys. They were memorizing the Li Jing ritual code so strict that even mourning a relative came with a precise number of days, tears, and gestures. Break the rules? It wasn't rudeness, it was rebellion. In Azadchar, the Persian heartland, young royals were trained in the art of optics, not visual science, but political appearances. It wasn't just about how to sit or speak, it was about how to absorb insult with a smile, how to speak in riddles when spies filled the room, and how to wield silence as if it were a blade. In the subcontinental courts of Sindhara, where the Arthashastra ruled alongside the Vedas, royal children were drilled in the Natya Dharma, the sacred law of performance in politics. They learned when to flatter, when to suspect, and how to politely sidestep betrayal, because one naive handshake could cost you your crown or your head. Even in the sparkling intellect of Etheria, our counterpart to ancient Athens, charm was a currency. Young nobles were taught charis, the kind of magnetic grace that could sway juries, win assemblies, and distract enemies. In Rome's marble-clad courts, heirs like Juno Cassian were trained not just in battle tactics, but in venia, the art of gracious manipulation. A smile could deceive. A toast could be a trap. Meanwhile, in the sun-drenched kingdom of Nilatu, our stand-in for Egypt, the pharaoh's children were living embodiments of cosmic law. They were taught to move with divine elegance, never slouch, never raise their voice, never break serenity, because even their posture was political theology. Stillness wasn't submission, it was control. But beneath all that etiquette lay something darker. Every flicker of an eye was being watched. Every word was weighed. Tutors weren't just teachers, they were spies, mentors, and bodyguards rolled into one. They taught their charges not just how to speak, but how to read a room, spot deception, and test loyalty with a single phrase. Paranoia wasn't a flaw, it was protection. Because behind the gold-framed walls and embroidered curtains, royal education wasn't about innocence, it was about preparation. These weren't children, they were chess pieces made human. And every lesson carried the weight of a kingdom. A single mistake? Catastrophic. A single success? Eternal. Take the story of Alistair the Lionborner, named for Alexander the Great. His conquests weren't fueled by cavalry alone. They were ignited in the libraries of Lycia, under the careful mentorship of Aristotle, philosopher who sculpted his soul. From metaphysics to ethics, history to ambition, Alistair didn't just inherit a kingdom. He was engineered to expand it. He didn't merely wage war, he carried knowledge like a sword-spreading culture, science, and diplomacy wherever he rode. His victories weren't just military, they were mental. He was a conqueror in dialogue as much as in armor. Now contrast that with Nero Calvus, the infamous Roman tyrant, trained by the esteemed sage Serene, a stoic with silver morals and golden patience. Nero had access to the best that education could offer. And yet, his reign spiraled into paranoia, sadism, and disgrace. Why? Because instruction alone wasn't enough. A blade in the hand doesn't guarantee honor. Sometimes, it cuts the wrong way. The lesson? Education was a cruciblino, a guarantee. A throne could be built with books, yes, but it could crumble just as easily under poor character. And let's not forget the queens. Royal daughters weren't raised to twirl and smile. In many courts, they were chess masters in silk robes. A consort today could be regent tomorrow. A princess could become a peace offeringer, a sovereign. Look at Selene of the South River or Mirror for Cleopatra. Fluent in multiple tongues, trained in economics, religion, and subterfuge. Her power wasn't in beauty but in brain. Her lovers may have been emperors, but her control of the Nile was her own. Or Wu Zhaoliner version of Wu Zetian. Born into a world where women were supposed to decorate the court, she educated herself beyond expectation, navigating backdoor politics, assassination attempts, and bureaucratic landmines to become the sole female emperor of Zhonghua. These women weren't anomalies. They were products of intense, quiet preparation. Their tutors taught them how to listen when no one spoke, how to write laws disguised as poetry, and how to survive betrayals with their legacy intact. Even in death, their education endured. Many of these rulers, once seated on the throne, became patrons of learning. They built libraries, sanctuaries of wisdom, and codified their childhood lessons into state curriculum. Their personal crucibles became national blueprints, and in doing so, they left something behind that no sword could destroy. A system, a legacy, a path. Because the royal child wasn't just the future of the family, they were the soul of the civilization's bet on itself. Every scroll they copied, every coin spent on a tutor, every sleepless night under a full moon of pressurate was all an investment. In the realm of kings and queens, greatness wasn't born. It was trained, forged, conditioned. Sometimes with love, often with fear, and always with precision. Follow the channel for more historical deep dives and lost legacies that shaped our world. If you thought royal life was all gold and roses, well, you just stepped into the crucible.